In the dim hush of the great September of Baylor, the candles always seemed to cast taller shadows than they ought. Their flames sputtered against the chill draft that slithered through ancient stone corridors and soared beneath the lofty domes. On this particular morning, dawn's light had not fully penetrated the stained glass windows when a ripple of anxious anticipation ran through the sept's worshippers. Whispers of disquiet had circled among the devout for days now, turning fervent prayers into uneasy hushes. The high sparrow, robed simply in undyed wool, paced along the polished marble floor near the altar. His feet were bare, and though his voice was soft, his words managed to carry with a resonance both reassuring and mildly disconcerting. Beside him stood a cluster of similarly garbed faith militant, each with the seven-pointed star etched or embroidered somewhere across their person. Their presence in such numbers would have been unthinkable only a short time ago. Yet here they were, unopposed, each man's face set in grim purpose. Tommen Baratheon still wore the crown, though it seemed to weigh heavier on him each passing day. He was a kind boy, too gentle for the harsh edges of kingship, and that gentleness had endeared him to many. But in times of trouble, kindness could be a fatal flaw. Rumors swirled of disloyalty in the Red Keep, of dissatisfaction among the common folk who had once been charmed by Marjorie Tyrell's philanthropic visits to Flea Bottom. The faith, newly resurrected in its militant form, was gaining adherents from every layer of the city. Hungry men lured by the promise of righteous power, devout women who saw the High Sparrow as a messianic figure, and even certain lords whose influence was waning and who clutched at any chance to remain relevant in the uncertain tides of power. Outside, King's Landing struggled to carry on as usual. Merchants hawked their wares in the market squares, though they were fewer than before. The noble houses still attended feasts and plotted their intrigues, but a certain dread hung over them. They had witnessed what the faith militant had done to those considered sinners. They had watched, aghast, as even queens and lords had been paraded through the streets, or else locked away, subjected to the faith's scrutiny. Yet for all that, this was not the old faith militant of centuries past. These men and women believed in the High Sparrow's vision of purging corruption, of humbling the proud, of binding the realm together beneath the mercy of the Seven. They truly believed that cleansing violence was a small price to pay for a kingdom free of sin. In the middle of that uneasy calm, the hour of upheaval came. On a day that began much like any other, King Tommen had convened a small council to discuss the pressing crises. The crown's debts, the harvest yields, the brewing tension with the North. Marjorie Tyrell, still wearing the circlet of a queen, stood behind him with that serene confidence that had once drawn the attention of an adoring crowd. Cersei Lannister was absent from this council. Her presence had become sporadic since her own humiliations. On the council, only Kevan Lannister, her brother-in-law, gave voice to certain practicalities, though his eyes kept flicking around, as if seeking a threat behind every window and door. Grand Maester Pycelle droned on about grain shipments, his words as slow as his shuffling steps. The tension was almost suffocating. Jaime Lannister was not there, having been dispatched elsewhere on a mission for the crown, or so Tommen had told himself. In truth, the Kingsguard had been stretched thin, placed in awkward positions of balancing loyalty between the king and the faith. The knights of the Kingsguard who remained seemed uneasy, too. They had not taken the vow to protect the king only to see themselves overshadowed by barefoot fanatics with cudgels and a burning sense of zeal. But so it was a reflection of the times. They came that very noon. The High Sparrow's faithful, bearing arms under the starry banners of the Seven, marched through the cobblestone streets of King's Landing and arrived at the Red Keep with neither haste nor stealth. They had no reason to hide. At their head stood the High Sparrow, his graying hair and mild, ascetic features belied by the unwavering steel in his gaze. Around him, the faith militants stood in ranks, shoulder to shoulder, an unwavering tide. The gold cloaks, City Watch, made a half-hearted attempt to bar their path, but once they realized the might arrayed against them and saw that any violence would spark an inferno, they shrank back. No call was given for the archers to loose arrows from the ramparts. No horns were sounded. The faith was not an invading army in the usual sense. Many within those walls sympathized with them, or at least they feared them enough to stay silent. King Tommen, alerted late to this development, barely had time to assemble the Kingsguard in the throne room. Margaery Tyrell insisted on being by his side. Her lovely brow furrowed with apprehension she tried to hide. Kevan Lannister stood near as well, his jaw set. The footfalls of the approaching Faith Militant echoed down the Red Keep's corridors. Tommen's heart pounded. He was a boy who sought to do good, to protect his people. And yet now he saw the lines had been drawn. The throne room doors swung open. The High Sparrow entered as though the great hall were simply another space of worship. Steady, measured strides, unwavering calm. The Faith Militant came behind him, a living wave of grim conviction. There was no immediate bellow, no rallying cry, no clamor of swords. Instead, the High Sparrow advanced quietly until he stood before the Iron Throne, that monstrous seat of fused swords. Tommen sat stiff-spined, and for a brief moment, the Boy King's young face tried to assume a regal mask, though the uncertain quiver of his lips betrayed him. Margaery placed a hand on his shoulder. The High Sparrow bowed, just deeply enough to show a veneer of respect. "Your Grace," he said gently, "we come before you today in the light of the Seven, seeking to guide the realm to a path of righteousness. There are grievous sins here, within these very walls, that must be atoned for if we are to end the wars and strife that plague us." Tommen swallowed. His voice, when it came, was timid. Good High Septon, the Crown has tried to meet your concerns. I have allowed you to reform the Faith Militant. I have cooperated with your investigations." "Aye." The High Sparrow shook his head, a small, pained smile crossing his lips. "Your Grace, your intentions are pure, but the realm's corruption is deep-rooted, and you are surrounded by those who would compromise your goodness. The poor cry for justice. The realm bleeds from old wounds. We cannot wait any longer for half measures." Alarm flickered in Margaery's eyes as she regarded the mass of armed faithful behind him. She could sense what was coming, and though she had played the Game of Thrones with remarkable skill thus far, she realized in that heartbeat how tenuous her husband's hold on power truly was. The Tyrell name was strong. Highgarden boasted wealth and food supplies that had often propped up the crown. But the faith, fueled by the fervor of the small folk, held a moral authority that could ripple into outright popular revolt. If the small folk turned on the Tyrells, no amount of coin or grain would help her hold on to her queenly seat. Quietly, Margaery spoke. "Your Grace, we should listen to what the High Sparrow desires. There may yet be a peaceful path." Even then, she was playing for time, hoping to avoid a direct confrontation that would be disastrous. But behind her, Kevan Lannister stood, bristling. He seemed to sense the irreparable challenge to royal authority. One hand rested on his sword hilt. The Kingsguard, too, looked ready to spring into action, though they were hopelessly outnumbered. The High Sparrow's voice remained level, yet there was an iron note now. "There is no more time for secrets, for deals behind closed doors. In the name of the Seven, we must purify the heart of the realm. We come to free you, King Tommen, from the clutches of those who use you for their own ends." He turned his gaze across the throne room, scanning over Kevan, Pycelle, and especially Margaery. Then, in a sweep, he gestured with one hand. The Faith Militant advanced, staves and swords at the ready. Tommen reflexively stood, almost stumbling in his alarm. A cry of alarm echoed as the Kingsguard drew their steel, but no pitched battle erupted in that moment. Instead, the High Sparrow raised a calming hand to forestall violence. "Stand down," he said quietly, addressing the ranks behind him. "We are not butchers. The king is still the king. But to preserve his soul, and the souls of his subjects, we must remove the evils that surround him." At his nod, two men of the Faith Militant stepped forward, arms outstretched, and seized Margaery Tyrell gently by the elbows. Another pair closed in on Kevan Lannister, though they hesitated somewhat, mindful of the sword at his side. Margaery started to protest, but the High Sparrow's voice cut through the tension. "Queen Margaery, your outward piety was an inspiration to many, but your heart is burdened by ambition and earthly desires that have no place in the seat of our most holy monarchy." She tried to retort, but found no words that would keep them at bay. Kevin Lannister's protest was more forceful. "This is treason," he growled. "The faith has no authority to pass such judgment on the crown." He went for his sword, but before he could fully draw it, a dozen faith militants surged forward. In a swift, practiced motion, they disarmed him and forced him to his knees. Throughout it all, Tommen stood there, stunned, looking more like a helpless child than the king of the Seven Kingdoms. The High Sparrow approached the Iron Throne itself. "Your Grace," he murmured, inclining his head in a gesture of reverence that still somehow felt like a command. "The time has come to cast aside those who would mislead you. We pledge ourselves to you, King Tommen, as the father of the realm. But the Seven have spoken to me, and I have seen the darkness lurking around your house. We must cleanse it. Will you allow us to free you from these influences?" Marjorie's eyes flickered to Tommen's, pleading. She loved him in her own fashion, perhaps not with the simple sincerity of a common girl, but as her husband, a gentle soul she had tried to help rule more effectively. She did not want to see him dethroned or harmed. She did not want to see herself cast into ruin, either. Tommen's lips parted. He wanted to save her. But in that moment, he realized the faith had come not simply to accuse or judge one or two individuals, but to commandeer the monarchy's legitimacy itself. He looked around. He saw the fear, the shock, the inevitability. The city had turned to the faith. The small folk, in their multitudes, supported the High Sparrow's mission of justice and penance. The crown was perched on his own brow, yet the authority had slipped to the barefoot man at his feet. He thought, just for a moment, of commanding his Kingsguard to strike. But the faith militant numbered in the hundreds, possibly thousands throughout the city, and if blood were shed here, the capital would drown in chaos. The High Sparrow seemed to sense Tommen's hesitation. "We are here for you, my king. We wish only to set you on the path of piety," he said, voice almost tender. "I will not ask you to abandon your seat, but I ask you to turn away from those who have guided you falsely." For an agonizing instant, Tommen nearly yielded. He thought of all the horrors that had befallen his mother, his wife, his brother's consort before her. He thought of how the realm tore itself apart in constant strife. He asked himself if perhaps it would be better, simpler, for him to let the faith guide the realm toward unity and peace. But then came the voice of a child, a memory that was his own. "My father was King Robert, my brother was King Joffrey, and now I am King Tommen." The thought reminded him that kings were not supposed to kneel to septons. I cannot," Tommen said, his voice trembling. "I cannot abandon them, nor can I allow you to simply seize them. This is not the will of the realm." The High Sparrow sighed, and for an instant, sorrow flickered in his eyes. "I had hoped you would see, but you are yet bound by sin's coils." He made a subtle gesture. That was when the faith militant closed ranks around the Iron Throne. The knights of the Kingsguard, outnumbered and unprepared for such an organized push, soon found themselves surrounded. Swords were raised, curses flung, and in the swirl of conflict, Tommen was pulled from the throne by faith soldiers who pinned his arms. Though they tried to do so gently, there was inevitable scuffling, and Tommen cried out in alarm. Marjorie screamed his name, Kevin roared in fury, and the throne room descended into chaos. When at last the shouting died and the iron-shod footsteps of the faith militant stilled, Tommen and Marjorie were separated, each held under guard. Kevin knelt on the marble floor, wrists bound. Of the Kingsguard, several had been knocked unconscious or subdued, their weapons confiscated. Pycelle cowered near a column, trembling from head to toe. The High Sparrow stood at the edge of the dais where the Iron Throne loomed, gazing at the seat as though appraising a relic from a more barbaric time. In a voice that carried despite its quietness, he addressed the onlookers still present. "For too long have the kings and queens of this realm flaunted the laws of gods and men. We have endured tyrants, children manipulated by sinful kin, and endless wars that kill the innocent while the guilty thrive. Enough! The Seven have revealed a new way." He turned, his eyes resting on Tommen, who had tears in his eyes, not from physical pain but from shock and betrayal. King Tommen Baratheon is but a boy, and though his heart is kind, he has been led astray by those who would use him for mortal gains. The Seven demand a ruler who will unite the realm under their grace, not squander it for personal ambition. A hush fell upon the hall. The wind beyond the windows seemed to sigh as though some great turning point had arrived, a page about to be turned in the living history of Westeros. Then the High Sparrow said, in a tone of inexorable finality, "I declare that Tommen Baratheon is no longer fit to rule. As the chosen voice of the Seven, I proclaim his seat forfeit." It was an echo of history repeating itself. Where once Targaryen kings had faced rebellions by faith militant, now it was a Lannister Baratheon child who sat on the Iron Throne, about to be supplanted by the fervor of religious zeal. No official anointment by the High Septon, no coronation recognized by all the lords of the realm could legitimize this moment in the eyes of the Old Guard. But the High Sparrow did not care. He had the city, he had the hearts of the small folk, and he had unstoppable conviction on his side. Chaos reigned in the hours that followed. The streets rang with the news. King Tommen was deposed, the faith had seized control, and a new king was to be crowned, someone who would supposedly embody the piety and justice of the Seven. Mothers clutched their children, uncertain what this would mean for the future. Gold cloaks either deserted their posts or quietly awaited orders from the new regime. The lords and ladies in the city barricaded themselves in their manors, uncertain whether to flee or bow to the High Sparrow. The Red Keep itself was under de facto occupation by the faith militant, who patrolled the corridors, ensuring that no loyalist surge could retake Tommen's seat by force. Rumors flew regarding who would ascend the throne in Tommen's stead. Some said the High Sparrow sought to rule himself as a warrior prophet. Others speculated that the faith had discovered a pious young noble with distant Targaryen or Baratheon blood to place upon the throne. There were even outlandish whispers that the faith was in contact with some rumored illegitimate offspring of Robert or Rhaegar, a dark horse candidate who could unite the realm with the blessing of the Seven. Yet within the Red Keep's walls, amid flickering torchlight, the High Sparrow and his most trusted followers gathered in council. They spoke in hushed voices, using a cramped antechamber they had commandeered near the Great Hall. The High Sparrow himself looked weary. He knew that removing Tommen would shake the Seven Kingdoms to its core, and that was precisely the intention. There could be no half-turn from sin. The monarchy had to be reborn under the watchful eyes of the Seven. But the question was, who to anoint as the new king? Every choice had consequences. Place a man of questionable heritage on the throne and risk losing the tenuous support of the great lords. Choose an outsider with no recognized lineage, and the entire foundation of monarchy might crumble, sending the realm into chaos. Yet the High Sparrow believed wholeheartedly that the realm's true authority derived from the divine, not from mortal bloodlines. One suggestion came from a member of the faith militant known as Brother Lancel, once Lancel Lannister. He had shaved his golden hair, donned the homespun robes, and mortified his flesh for the sake of atonement. He had once belonged to House Lannister, close kin to the Boy King, but had renounced his worldly attachments to serve the faith. He was, however, still of noble birth, still a man with recognized status in the old order. "If lineage is what we require," he said, his tone low, "then let me serve the Seven's will. It is not for my own ambition, but to legitimize what we have begun." His gaze flickered with fervor. Others in the room, mostly common men elevated by the High Sparrow's leadership, looked uneasy. Some believed that Lancel's presence might send a contradictory message, that the faith had dethroned Tommen, only to place another Lannister on the throne. Yet the High Sparrow considered Lancel's words. He saw in the young man a redeemed sinner, someone who had turned his back on the vanity and corruption of his family. Still, naming Lancel king might give the impression that the faith was simply trading one Lannister puppet for another. The High Sparrow wanted something purer, more emblematic of the new order. Another voice proposed a lesser cousin of House Baratheon, well known for his piety, but that man was a drunkard in truth. Another suggestion was that the High Sparrow himself take the throne as a holy ruler, but he dismissed that idea at once. "My duty is not to reign as a king," he said. I serve the realm as the voice of the seven. Let us not repeat the errors of pride. Eventually, they reached a consensus on a man named Ser Theoden Wells, a knight once known for his devout observance of the faith. He was from a minor Undul lineage in the Vale, unconnected to the major power blocks that had warred for years. He carried no overshadowing name, no wealth to speak of, but he had fought in the War of the Five Kings on the side of House Arryn and served with quiet distinction. Since the war's end, he had devoted himself wholly to the faith, rumored to have parted ways with worldly ambition after witnessing the ravages of battle. The High Sparrow had once encountered him distributing food to the poor in Flea Bottom, and since then, the knight had become a prominent figure among the faithful. Ser Theoden was no politician, no cunning manipulator. He was, in many ways, a simple soldier who believed in justice and mercy. To place him on the throne would be radical, but the High Sparrow argued that radical change was needed. The man had a distant trace of Targaryen blood from a great-great-grandmother. Like half the families in Westeros, it sometimes seemed, but more importantly, he had the devotion of the small folk. When he had arrived in King's Landing, he shared their bread, prayed with them, protected them from predatory sellswords or unscrupulous gold cloaks. In the eyes of many believers, he was the best mortal embodiment of knightly virtue. That was enough for the faith for now. Thus, Ser Theoden Wells was summoned to the Red Keep. He arrived modestly, wearing only a simple tunic beneath his patched cloak, carrying neither banners nor a retinue. When the High Sparrow's council revealed their decision, his eyes widened in shock and horror. "Me, King? I've no desire for a crown," he stammered. "I am but a humble knight. Even in that, I have not always succeeded." Yet the High Sparrow, with his soft conviction, assured Theoden that this was the Seven's will. "We have prayed upon it, searched our hearts, and we find that you, untainted by the vices of the great houses, may lead the realm to redemption." Many times, Theoden tried to refuse. He could see the enormity of the burden. He understood that the lords of Westeros would never easily accept a king who rose from such modest stock. Still, the High Sparrow insisted, and the faith militant who had fought alongside Theoden during the war spoke in support. Finally, pressed from all sides, Theoden sank to his knees and prayed for guidance. When he rose, with tears of both awe and dread in his eyes, he nodded. "If it is the Seven's will, then I shall answer." The next day, an unprecedented sight met the eyes of all who gathered in the square of the Great September. The faith militant, in formation, ringed the perimeter. Hundreds of small folk thronged behind them, murmuring in awe and confusion. At the center of this wide space stood the High Sparrow, holding a simple wooden crown carved with 7-pointed stars inlaid with bits of colored glass. Next to him stood Ser Theoden Wells, clad not in magnificent royal garb, but in the plain white robes the High Sparrow had provided. His hair was still dusty from travel, and he bore a small scar across his cheek from a past skirmish. No members of the traditional aristocracy stood near to place a cloak of their house upon him, nor did any Targaryen or Baratheon-forged blade officially knight him anew. Instead, the High Sparrow recited an invocation to the father, the mother, the warrior, the maiden, the smith, the crone, and the stranger. He held aloft the wooden crown, turning it so that its glass inlays caught the morning sun and dazzled the crowd. Then, in a clear voice, he proclaimed, "Behold Ser Theoden Wells, chosen of the Seven, a knight of humility and virtue. Let him be anointed to sit upon the Iron Throne, to guide our realm in the path of righteousness, to uphold the laws of gods and men, and to cast out corruption wherever it lurks. May the Seven bless and protect him." He placed the crude crown upon Theoden's head. A hush descended. For a breath, it seemed time itself had frozen. No band struck up a grand coronation anthem. No lord declared fealty in the tradition of bending the knee. Instead, the small folk began to mumble uncertainly. Some fell to their knees in prayer, seeing in this moment a sign that the world was indeed changing by the hand of the divine. Others whispered that they had traded one puppet for another. Still others, many who had suffered under the Lannister rule or Tyrell manipulations, embraced this new king wholeheartedly, grasping at the hope that the faith would spare them further suffering. Amid the swirl of confusion and awe, Theoden looked out across the sea of faces. They yearned for a better world, and his heart ached to think how heavy the burden of leadership would be. But he saw children in the crowd who wore rags, and older women cradling bowls of thin gruel, and men missing limbs from the wars. If he could bring them peace, he thought, then perhaps he would endure the weight of the crown. Thus began the strange new reign. Tommen Baratheon, dethroned but kept alive in the Red Keep under the watch of the Faith Militant, was not cast into a dungeon. The High Sparrow insisted on showing mercy. Tommen was allowed certain liberties, though he was carefully prevented from contacting any outside supporters. Margaery Tyrell, too, was held in a separate set of chambers, her once regal attire replaced by the more austere clothing the Faith deemed acceptable. She recognized the precariousness of her position. Her grandmother, Lady Olenna Tyrell, would no doubt be outraged by these developments. But for now, Margaery had to tread carefully. The Faith had proven they could do the unthinkable, dethrone a king in plain sight. If they could do that to the king, they could do far worse to a captive queen. Cersei Lannister, conspicuously absent from the throne room at the moment of the coup, was another matter. It took days for her to realize just how thoroughly the Faith had seized power. She had retreated to her private rooms, her circle of loyalists shrinking by the hour. Ser Robert Strong, the silent behemoth who served as her sworn protector, was her only real bulwark against the Faith. Rumors spoke of him crushing men's skulls with a single blow, and the Faith Militant were understandably wary of him. For a few nights, no direct confrontation occurred. The Faith carefully avoided storming her quarters, perhaps concerned about what monstrous strength Ser Robert possessed. Or perhaps they believed dealing with Cersei could wait. During those uncertain nights, the realm began to tremble at the news. In the north, the lords of Winterfell heard the bizarre tidings. King Tommen deposed, some unknown knight crowned in the name of the Seven. The North was not particularly devout to the Faith. They had their own gods. Though some suspected an opportunity to assert independence, others worried that the madness in King's Landing would bring more chaos. Across the sea in the Redwine Straits, the Tyrell fleet anchored in the hope that their new queen, Margaery, remained secure. The Iron Islands continued their own squabbles. Dorne, simmering with resentments, had little reason to rally to the Lannister cause. As for the Riverlands, ravaged by war, many lords quietly thought they might wait to see who emerged victorious in this new order. The Vale was in flux, with Littlefinger maneuvering behind the scenes. And in the Stormlands, patchwork alliances tried to decide if this new so-called King Theoden had any rightful claim. King Theoden, for his part, felt torn between two extremes. On one side, he was expected to serve as a figurehead of the Faith's new regime, stamping out corruption and punishing those deemed sinners. On the other, he was a man who knew war too well and dreaded seeing the realm plunged back into violence. He walked a razor's edge. The High Sparrow reminded him daily that the Seven demanded strict justice, that the old ways must be cast aside so the realm could be born anew. Yet Theoden saw that not all men labeled sinners by the Faith were truly evil. Some simply had the misfortune of crossing the Faith's path. In the early days of his reign, he tried to issue pardons for small offenses, such as petty theft or unlicensed hawking. He believed that mercy was an attribute of the Seven as well as justice. But the Faith Militant, for their part, wanted to make examples of those who defied the new order. More than one unfortunate pickpocket found themselves whipped or mutilated for repeated offenses. Theoden struggled with these harsh measures, feeling the pang of guilt. But each time he tried to intervene, the High Sparrow calmly reminded him that mercy without reparation for sin would only encourage wrongdoing. He also found himself confronted with the complexities of governance. The royal treasury was nearly empty, thanks to the wars and the crown's debts to the Iron Bank. Food shortages threatened the city if trade was disrupted by the chaos of the coup. The great lords of the realm demanded recognition, but many refused to come to King's Landing for an audience with a king whose name carried no weight. Theoden wrote letters, handwritten pleas for unity in the name of the Seven, but few lords replied, and fewer still gave him open support. Of all the houses, House Tyrell was the biggest threat. Angered beyond measure that their beloved Marjorie had been taken from them, their soldiers prepared for war. Lady Olenna Tyrell was rumored to have stormed about her high garden chambers, cursing the faith in terms that would make a Dothraki blush. But launching an assault on the city would be no simple matter. The faith militant had thousands of devout men in King's Landing, and if the Tyrells stormed the gates, they risked turning the entire population against them. Besides, the Tyrells prided themselves on their popularity and generosity with the small folk. It was widely believed that Mace Tyrell would try negotiations before open war, if only to maintain that favorable standing. But Lady Olenna was no fool. She would weigh each possibility carefully. If negotiations failed, she might well endorse a swift, punishing strike to free Marjorie and remove this upstart king. The High Sparrow recognized the Tyrell menace. He urged Theoden to remain steadfast. "Our cause is righteous," he said. "If the Tyrells come with swords, then their blood is on their own hands. We will defend the holy seat." Yet privately, the High Sparrow knew that a direct assault from Highgarden's forces could be devastating. He considered the possibility of forging alliances with other regions to counter the Tyrell might. But who? The Lannisters had lost influence, the North was hardly an ally, the Stormlands were fragmented, and Dorne hated the Lannisters as well. Meanwhile, the Vale might be enticed with promises of religious glory. Many in the Vale were devout, after all, but forging that link would not be immediate. He also considered deploying Tommen and Marjorie as bargaining chips. Perhaps if House Tyrell threatened invasion, the Faith could send word that Marjorie's well-being depended on the Tyrells' restraint. Yet that route was perilous. The Faith risked turning the small folk against them if they were seen as tormenting a beloved queen. The High Sparrow preferred a more delicate approach. Use Marjorie to broadcast the message that the new regime was not cruel, that it welcomed the Tyrells should they repent. So far, Marjorie had refused to speak such words publicly, not wanting to betray her family. But the High Sparrow had ways of wearing down defiance. Meanwhile, behind the closed doors of the Red Keep, Tommen found himself in a state of near-shock. The boy who was once king spent long hours pacing his chambers, guarded at all times. He was not placed in a cell exactly, but the high walls and locked doors might as well have been bars. Sometimes, he would receive visits from the High Sparrow, who gently lectured him on humility and the wages of sin. Tommen could barely respond. He longed to see Marjorie. He worried for his mother, Cersei, though their relationship had strained since her humiliations. Mostly, he felt guilt. Guilt for not being stronger, guilt for letting this happen, guilt for letting his crown slip away so easily. Eventually, Tommen found the nerve to ask about Marjorie's situation, and the High Sparrow, to his credit, answered plainly. "She is safe, though no longer queen by any law. She is allowed to move about in certain confines. The Seven have not willed for her to be harmed. You may see her once your heart has opened to the truth." Tommen wasn't certain what that meant, but he swallowed hard and said, "You overthrew me." "Why?" "You overthrew yourself," the High Sparrow answered softly. "You entrusted your rule to those who considered themselves above the gods and the people. Your own heart faltered in the face of the realm's corruption. Do not despair. In time, perhaps you will accept the Seven's mercy." The days stretched into a fortnight. The new King Theoden was officially recognized in a grand ceremony inside the Great September of Baelor, though ironically, the space felt emptier than it had for Tommen's wedding. The great lords and ladies were absent, leaving mostly the faithful and a few local courtiers. Still, the High Sparrow anointed him with the 7 oils, reading from the same sacred texts once used to legitimize Targaryen rule. The ceremony felt both solemn and strange. Some men in attendance wept openly, believing they stood witness to a miracle. Others stared, uncertain whether they should hope or fear for this new monarchy. In that same period, the faith's hold on the city tightened further. The Crownlands, though still reeling from the turmoil of war, seemed to obey Theoden's commands if only to avoid conflict. The small folk turned out for Theoden's addresses, in which he pledged to protect them from the abuses of highborn tyranny. He walked among them, distributing bread and urging them to keep faith with the 7. That earned him a measure of genuine admiration, enough so that, despite the shock of Tommen's removal, a portion of the city began to warm to their new king. If a man would share in their hardships, perhaps he was better than the old puppet kings. Cersei, however, could not abide this new order. Night after night, she conspired with Qyburn, whispering about the possibility of unleashing Ser Robert Strong to cut down the High Sparrow and the entire Faith militant leadership in one bloody stroke. Qyburn cautioned her that such a plan might lead to the destruction of half the city. "Even a giant cannot fight 1,000 men at once, my lady," he warned, "and the small folk might tear you apart if they see you slay their holy leaders." But Cersei's pride bristled at the notion of bowing to these barefoot fanatics. The throne was stolen from her child. She dreamed of unleashing wildfire if necessary, turning the city's serpentine streets into a funeral pyre for the faith. But she needed the right moment. One night, a band of Faith militant arrived outside her chambers. Torches in hand, they pounded on the doors, demanding entry. Ser Robert Strong stood guard. No order from the High Sparrow could quell the abomination's loyalty to Cersei. When they tried to force their way in, Ser Robert stepped forward, looming like a giant of iron. None dared cross that threshold. A tense standoff lasted an hour, until at last the Faith militant withdrew to consult the High Sparrow. It was said that, behind the closed doors, Cersei laughed a brittle laugh. "They fear me still," she murmured. But she also knew that she was all but besieged, with no allies in the Red Keep strong enough to save her from an eventual assault. At the High Sparrow's urging, King Theoden tried to end this standoff peacefully. He went in person, accompanied by a heavy guard, of course, to speak to Cersei. He stood outside her barred doors and spoke through them, voice firm yet polite. "I come in the name of the Seven to negotiate a peaceful resolution. We do not wish for further bloodshed. You were once the Queen Regent and mother to the king, but that time has passed. Now you must answer for your sins, the same as any other soul." She answered through the door, her voice dripping with scorn. "Your name means nothing to me, Ser Theoden Wells. You are no king. I have known kings. My father served a mad one. I bore two from my own womb. You are but a puppet dancing on a barefooted beggar's string." King Theoden pursed his lips. He had been called worse on the battlefield, but it still pained him to be so summarily dismissed. "Lady Cersei, whatever your grudge against the faith, I urge you to consider the city. If you make war here, countless innocents will suffer. Then remove yourself from the Red Keep," she snapped. "Release my son, restore him to the throne that is rightfully his, and see the High Sparrow burn in the flames he so piously dreads. Do that, and you may leave with your life." There could be no reconciliation. Theoden sighed and departed. The High Sparrow did not order a direct assault that night, but it was clear that confrontation with Cersei lay ahead. In hushed circles, some within the Faith militant wondered why the High Sparrow hesitated. The truth was that he found the matter of Tommen's mother to be personally vexing. He believed in redemption, even for the worst sinners, but he saw precious little contrition in Cersei. Yet to kill her outright might brand the Faith as the same sort of ruthless tyrants they had opposed. So the standoff continued, a dagger's point pressed against the city's throat. Elsewhere in the realm, the Tyrells' patience was running thin. Their outriders approached the outskirts of King's Landing, openly wearing Tyrell livery, though no large host dared to come too close yet. A delegation arrived one morning, led by Randyll Tarly, a bannerman of Highgarden known for his strict discipline. Tarly was a proud man, not easily cowed, and he carried with him an ultimatum from Lady Olenna and Mace Tyrell. Release Margaery Tyrell at once, or the Tyrell forces would cut off all food shipments to King's Landing, plunging the city into famine. King Theoden, hearing this demand, paled. He knew well that King's Landing relied heavily on the Tyrell supplies to feed its teeming masses. "We cannot allow thousands to starve," he told the High Sparrow. "Is there no middle ground?" The High Sparrow seemed unmoved. "They hold the realm's bread, and we hold their beloved daughter. They would starve themselves of her presence if they persist in threatening the city." Theoden pressed. "Is that truly the path of the Seven? To let innocents suffer the pangs of hunger for the sake of your pride?" The High Sparrow turned, eyes calm but piercing. It is not pride that motivates me. It is duty. Should we yield to blackmail, we allow House Tyrell to continue in its ways of cunning and indulgence. The realm would remain under the yoke of lords who consider themselves above the gods. This is the time to stand firm. And so, negotiations ground on in an uneasy stalemate. Randall Tarley was not a man of idle threats. He relayed the High Sparrow's refusal back to his overlords in Highgarden. Soon, the trickle of supplies from the Reach slowed to a near stop. Prices soared in the city. The small folk muttered that the new king had promised them bread. But now there was none to be had. The faith militant responded by redoubling their religious fervor, preaching that the Tyrells were punishing the faithful. Many believed it, stoked by the sermons of devout septons who declared the Tyrell embargo an affront to the Seven. Hunger began to set in. The mood in King's Landing turned tense and resentful. Theoden personally arranged the distribution of what grain remained in the royal stores, but it was nowhere near enough. By the end of the second week of the embargo, crowds of gaunt-faced men and women gathered outside the Red Keep, shouting for bread. Simultaneously, the city's rooftops rang with secret conspiracies. Some whispered that they should let Tommen return. He had been kinder, more in tune with the needs of the people. Others insisted that the faith was right, and that House Tyrell was to blame. In the darker alleyways, seeds of rebellion sprouted. A group of Sellswords, once loyal to the crown, now debated whether to break Tommen free or offer their services to the Tyrells for coin and food. A cunning man named Farmer Rivers, claiming to be an illegitimate scion of the Targaryens, started recruiting men for an uprising. And more than a few city watchmen grew uncertain which side they served now, if any. Of this weighed upon Theoden's mind. He was no cunning spymaster or politician. He tried to do what he believed was right, but found himself mired in the complexities of the realm's politics. Each day, he attended councils with the High Sparrow and the other leading figures of the faith. With every new predicament, the High Sparrow's solution was the same: have faith. The Seven will guide us. But Theoden wanted to do something tangible to prevent the city from tearing itself apart. He found himself often alone in the royal apartments, where the trappings of kingship felt alien: fine tapestries, golden tableware, and the looming weight of that monstrous iron throne. One afternoon, Theoden approached Margaery Tyrell in the presence of several faith militant guards. He wanted to hear her perspective, to try to reason with her. He found her in a modest solar, where she was allowed to take fresh air under guard. She had lost some of the glow that once surrounded her, though she still carried herself with composure. When Theoden entered, she regarded him with a cautious look, neither hostile nor friendly. "My lady," he began softly, "I beg your forgiveness for this intrusion. I wish to end the strife between your family and the city. Thousands will starve if the embargo continues." She crossed her arms, stepping away from the window's light. "And do you think I can snap my fingers and recall the armies of Highgarden? I am locked here, with no voice in my family's decisions." He dipped his head apologetically. "I know, which is why I intend to allow you to write a letter to your grandmother, Lady Olenna. Perhaps if you urge her to reason, if you promise to guide the faith to more moderate measures, we can find a resolution." Margaery studied him. She saw in him a sincerity unlike the ruthless cunning of the Lannisters. But she also recognized that he was the faith's chosen king, a man set up to dethrone her husband. And what are these moderate measures? Does the faith intend to let Tommen go free? To relinquish their hold on the throne they stole? Theoden looked uneasy. The faith believed Tommen's rule was tainted. "They say the same about you, though I do not doubt your devotion to the people. I cannot reverse that, but I can negotiate leniency, a path to reconciliation." She gave a brittle laugh. "Reconciliation, so that I may remain in comfortable captivity while you and your barefoot masters rule the realm? And what would become of my lord father's dignity, or my grandmother's pride, or my brother Loras, or the thousands of Reach soldiers who have sworn fealty to House Tyrell for generations? There can be peace. The faith does not wish to fight House Tyrell. We simply She cut him off, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. You simply wish to rule without opposition. You claim to serve the Seven, but you starve the city you swore to protect rather than make a single compromise. You hold Tommen in gilded chains. You say you do not want war, yet you invite it by dethroning a king recognized by every great house in Westeros. Tell me, King Theoden, who is truly in power, you or the High Sparrow? Are you truly so devout? Or are you just a man used as a figurehead? Theoden's face flushed. He recalled his vow to serve the people, the tears he shed at the sight of their suffering. I had hoped I could convince the High Sparrow to show more leniency. I do not crave power, but it was shown to me that the realm needed a king who was not corrupted by old alliances. I only wish to bring about a just rule. Marjorie regarded him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. I believe you mean that, she said at last. But you know as well as I do that in these halls, you are not the one giving orders. If you want to help these people, you need to stop acting like a puppet. Speak to the Tyrells without the High Sparrow's voice in your ear. Show us that you're willing to reach out an olive branch. A flicker of resolve sparked in Theoden's eyes. If I promised to do so, would you write to your grandmother? Urge her to negotiate? Urge her not to starve the city? She hesitated, then gave a slow nod. For the sake of the people, yes, I will write, but I will not simply betray my family. If you want me to encourage them to come to the table, you must be ready to release Tommen, at least into custody of a neutral party. And I want assurances that neither he nor I will be harmed. Theoden swallowed, knowing full well that the High Sparrow would object to releasing Tommen. But if the city starved, what good would that be for the faith's new rule? I will do what I can, he said. You have my word. And so, Marjorie sat down to write a letter, flanked by armed faith militant who watched her closely. Her letter was short but pointed, telling Olenna that there was a chance for negotiation if the Tyrells would relent on the embargo. Marjorie was careful not to promise too much, but it was enough to give her grandmother pause. As for Theoden, he braced himself to approach the High Sparrow on the matter of Tommen's conditional release. He was not naive. He suspected the old man would not yield easily. Indeed, when he brought it up in council, speaking quietly but firmly, the High Sparrow's expression grew pained. We cannot hand Tommen back to the Lannisters or the Tyrells, he said. That would allow them to rally behind him as a banner of rebellion. Theoden squared his shoulders. If we do not show some accommodation, thousands will die. This was not the reason I accepted this crown. Have we not said that we wish to protect the innocent? Then how can we allow them to waste away from hunger? The High Sparrow folded his hands. Our cause demands sacrifice. The old powers must understand that we will not yield to threats. If we give them an inch, they will demand a foot, a yard, and soon the new king will be dethroned as well. Rising from his seat, Theoden shook his head in frustration. Surely we can reach a middle ground. Tommen does not need to be restored as king, but perhaps we can give him into the custody of an impartial party, someone who will not use him to incite war. That sounds suspiciously like compromise with sin, replied one of the senior septons at the table. Tommen is the product of incest, an abomination in the eyes of the Seven. Theoden bristled. He's a boy who never asked for the circumstances of his birth. Would the Seven punish him for his parents' sins? Is that truly the justice we claim to serve? A hushed silence followed. At length, the High Sparrow inclined his head slightly. You are a compassionate man, Your Grace. That is not a fault. But you must not let compassion blind you to the ramifications of your actions. Very well, if you insist on exploring this path, then I will not forbid it. But I will remind you that your authority as king depends on the faith. Should you undermine our mission, you risk losing the blessings of the Seven and the support of the people who believe in us. It was a threat lightly veiled. Theoden recognized it, but he pressed on quietly. All I ask is that we open a dialogue with the Tyrells, offer a chance for peace before the city starves. They will only come to the table if we offer something in return, namely Tommen's safe handover to a neutral party, or at the very least, a promise not to harm him. The High Sparrow exchanged a look with his fellow faith leaders. After a moment, he exhaled. So be it. Make your offer. But you should be the one to speak to the Tyrell envoys and ensure they understand that Tommen will not be used as a banner for war. They must publicly acknowledge King Theoden if they wish to keep the boy alive. Theoden found his stomach twisting. Requiring House Tyrell to publicly acknowledge him as the rightful king would be a bitter demand, one he doubted Margaery's family would easily accept. But at least it was something, some chance to avert a famine. He bowed his head and left the council. That very evening, Theoden left the Red Keep with an honor guard of faith militant at his side. They exited through the Iron Gate, crossing the muddy lanes that led out to a small camp where Randyll Tarly's envoys awaited. The small folk paused in the streets to stare at their new king, whose presence was less gilded than Tommen's had been. Theoden wore plain armor, the seven-pointed star painted on his breastplate. He rode not a grand destrier but a sturdy courser with simple tack. The faith militant behind him had a certain solemn dignity, their white tabards embroidered with the star. Some in the crowd muttered or jeered, blaming him for the shortage of bread, but others bowed their heads in prayer as he passed. Theoden kept his eyes forward, feeling the weight of those gazes like stones on his shoulders. At the Tyrell outpost, Tarly's men greeted the new king with stiff, wary courtesy. They guided him to a large pavilion where Tarly himself waited, flanked by knights in green and gold livery. Theoden removed his helm as he entered, revealing the sweat on his brow from the warm day. Randyll Tarly was a tall, stern man, his mouth set in a hard line. He did not kneel or address Theoden by any royal style. Instead, he gave a curt nod. Ser Theoden, a bold visit, considering your city is on the brink of starvation. Theoden tried to speak calmly. I come to prevent that. As you surely know, the faith does not wish for war. We ask that the embargo be lifted, that we may feed the small folk. Tarly's lip curled. Yet you hold Lady Margaery as a hostage, and you dethroned the rightful king. The faith dethroned Tommen, yes? Theoden conceded. But Lady Margaery is not a hostage. She is being treated with respect. He did not mention that she was under guard at all times. I come with an offer. We are willing to release Tommen, so long as he is not used to usurp the throne or plunge the realm back into chaos. If House Tyrell will agree to a treaty and acknowledge my rule, then we can end this standoff. Tarly's gaze darkened. He clenched a fist at his side. You would have us betray Tommen. He is our queen's husband, the recognized king by all the great houses. Acknowledging you would be an insult to the memory of all who supported House Baratheon's claim. And you expect us to simply roll over because a band of barefoot septons says so? Theoden took a breath. I realize how difficult that is, but ask yourself this. Is forcing the city to starve worth it? Will the lords of Westeros truly rally behind your cause when they see that you are punishing thousands of innocent smallfolk? The faith may have stepped outside tradition by crowning me, but the realm is weary of war. The small folk might accept a new monarchy if it brings them peace. Peace under the yoke of religious fanatics? Tarly sneered. The Tyrells have always prided ourselves on feeding the people. We will feed them again, once this false king is removed and Lady Margaery is freed. Theoden spoke more urgently. Then let us find a compromise. I do not ask you to renounce Tommen in your hearts, but I do ask that you cease your hostility and let the food flow. We can save thousands of lives. You say that while still holding Margaery and Tommen. Without them, your new regime has no leverage over the Reach. If we feed the city without extracting any concessions, what's to stop your faith from turning on us the moment you are satisfied? Theoden hesitated. He knew that was a fair point. Yet if Tarly and the Tyrells demanded Theoden's abdication, all of this would be for naught. I will speak plainly, he said. We do not wish to fight the Tyrells, but the faith will not place Tommen back on the throne. That decision is final. If House Tyrell presses the matter with violence, we will fight to the last man. And if you starve the city, the faith militant may grow desperate. War and bloodshed will follow. Do you truly believe Lady Margaery would want that? Tarly stiffened at the mention of Margaery. His pride warred with his duty, which warred further with the reality that many of his own soldiers disliked the idea of starving the city. "Let me consult with my lord," he said at last. "In the meantime, we shall remain as we are. My men will not stand down, nor will our supplies resume." With that, the meeting ended in stalemate. Theoden returned to the Red Keep, disheartened. True to his word, Tarly relayed the conversation back to Highgarden, while Theoden told the High Sparrow that the Tyrell host was unwilling to accept his terms. Tensions soared. The city's food reserves dwindled further. Sporadic riots flared in Flea Bottom, quickly put down by the Faith Militant, whose harsh methods only embittered the survivors. Within the Red Keep, Tommen had grown sullen and withdrawn. On one of the rare occasions when Theoden was allowed to speak with him, the boy turned away, unable to face the man who wore the crown that should have been his. "I never did anything to you," Tommen said, barely above a whisper. "Why couldn't you just leave us in peace?" Theoden tried to explain that he never sought to be king, that the faith had insisted upon it for the good of the realm. But Tommen refused to meet his gaze, tears shining in his eyes. Theoden left the encounter feeling more like a usurper than ever. As the weeks crawled by, the first deaths from starvation were reported in the poorest districts. A hush of dread settled over King's Landing. The Faith Militant doubled their patrols, distributing meager rations where they could. The High Sparrow preached that the people must stay strong and trust in the Seven. Yet hungry men needed more tangible solace. A swirl of anger and resentment brewed. Some found scapegoats in rumored heretics, inciting vicious street attacks. Others began to whisper that King Theoden was powerless or uninterested in saving them. Graffiti appeared in back alleys, scrawled with mockery of the beggar king. Meanwhile, Lady Olenna Tyrell weighed the gravity of war. She knew that forcibly capturing King's Landing in open battle would be a massacre. But every day that passed saw her granddaughter in the hands of religious fanatics. Could she truly allow them to keep Marjorie forever? More importantly, what future was there for House Tyrell if they accepted Theoden as king? Tensions soared, and many in the Reach demanded action. In the midst of this brewing storm, Cersei Lannister made her move. After weeks of careful preparation with Qyburn, she believed she had discovered an opportunity to break the Faith's hold from within. She knew that if she tried to openly kill the High Sparrow, the small folk might riot. But if she could isolate him and the Faith Militant leadership in one place and trigger a catastrophic explosion of wildfire. Yes, it would be reminiscent of the Mad King's last days, but that was precisely her point. She did not care how many hundreds or thousands might die if it meant restoring her son to the throne. In secret, she conveyed a message to a select few among the Faith Militant, claiming she wished to surrender herself in the Great September of Baelor and make a public confession. Intrigued, the High Sparrow bit at the bait. He arranged for a grand ceremony, believing that seeing Cersei confess her crimes in front of the entire city would serve as a final demonstration of the Faith's power. He intended for King Theoden to attend as well, to show unity in the condemnation of the old regime's sins. That day, crowds began to gather around the Great September as word spread that Cersei Lannister would appear. Tension shimmered in the air. King Theoden, reluctant, was escorted to the Sept under heavy guard by the Faith Militant. The High Sparrow took his place at the altar, flanked by senior Septons who led the crowd in fervent prayer. Cersei was expected to arrive any moment. The Faith had posted watchers to ensure she did not bring Ser Robert Strong. All seemed poised for a decisive act of penance. But as the moments ticked by, Cersei did not appear. Instead, the watchers returned, uncertain. The High Sparrow frowned, wondering if she intended to spurn the summons entirely. The crowd murmured, restless. Theoden felt a prickle of anxiety. Something about this situation felt off. Then, from a far corner of the city, a sudden pillar of smoke and flame erupted. Wildfire, bright green, shot through the sky. The crowd gasped in horror. A second explosion rocked the western district, sending shockwaves that rattled windows. Screams tore through the streets as panic flared. In the Sept, people turned, looking for answers. Within moments, a messenger sprinted in, wild-eyed. "My High Holiness, the city is aflame. The Lannister queen. She. More words drowned in the clamor. Another blast shook the ground. Wildfire had been stashed in hidden caches beneath certain strategic points, triggered by Qyburn's loyalists. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, many of the Faith Militant rushed outside to try to aid the city or confront the fires. The High Sparrow tried to calm the worshippers, urging them to remain calm. But fear of wildfire was primal. Men and women stampeded for the doors. Some were trampled in the rush. Seizing the moment, a band of Lannister household guards who had slipped into the city launched an attack on the Sept's exterior. They clashed with the Faith Militant, steel ringing on steel. Meanwhile, inside the Red Keep, Qyburn orchestrated another gambit. Ser Robert Strong tore apart the Faith Guards who had watched Cersei's chambers. Freed, Cersei moved through hidden passages, aiming to reach Tommen. She would reclaim her son and flee, or else mount a last stand. Flames licked the sky over King's Landing, painting the city in an infernal glow. In the Great September, Theoden found himself jostled by terrified masses. He struggled to maintain composure, to call for calm. The High Sparrow stood near the altar, trying to quell the panic with prayers, but the roar of the explosions drowned out his voice. Outside, the streets were in pandemonium. Some sections of King's Landing burned in green wildfire. Others fell to looting and violence as mobs seized the chance to vent their fury. The Faith Militant tried to restore order, but they were stretched too thin. The City Watch, uncertain whom to obey, largely stood aside or joined in the chaos. In that swirling madness, Theoden realized that everything he had tried to build was on the verge of collapsing into blood and fire. The Faith had dethroned Tommen to bring peace and justice, but the realm had never been closer to total ruin. Grief and frustration boiled within him, and he shouted for the crowd to hear him, to calm themselves, but hardly anyone listened. They wanted to escape the Sept before it too went up in green flames. It was then that the High Sparrow beckoned Theoden to come closer, his visage grave. "King Theoden," he said, "the city is under attack by sin itself. You must stand firm. We can still turn this tide if we show the people that the Seven's light burns brighter than wildfire." But Theoden looked around at the terrified faces, at men being trampled, at women screaming for lost children. "There is no victory in this," he said hoarsely. "There never was. We have caused this through our refusal to compromise. We should have found a peaceful way." The High Sparrow's eyes hardened. "Peace with sin is no peace at all. Have faith, my king. The Seven will guide us through this trial. Gather the militant, quell the fires, restore order. The people must see their king leading the faithful. I will remain here, guiding them in prayer." Outside, the clash of steel grew louder. Theoden glimpsed the shapes of men in gold and red livery forcing their way toward the Sept steps, possibly trying to break inside or perhaps rescue someone. He realized that if they managed to kill the High Sparrow or him, it would be the end of the Faith's cause. King's Landing might fall to ruin entirely. Running out of time, Theoden faced a moment of truth. Was he truly the king, or just a figurehead? He could stand by the High Sparrow, trusting in prayer, or he could try to salvage lives in the city. "Very well," he said, turning away. "I will rally the Faith Militant to put out the fires and protect the innocent. Whatever your illusions of absolute purity, I will not stand idle while the city burns." He strode from the Sept with a small contingent of loyal men. Outside, the battle with Lannister soldiers was in full swing. Screams and the stench of burning flesh filled the air as pockets of wildfire ravaged entire city blocks. Yet Theoden saw a group of small folk cornered by men in Lannister colors, presumably looters or deserters gone rogue. The king drew his sword, calling to his companions, and charged. The clash was brutal, but Theoden fought with righteous fury. He saved the small folk from immediate harm, though he was wounded in the process. Blood stained his tunic. All across King's Landing, chaos reigned. Some sections of the city might have been spared the worst if not for the Faith's tenuous control. But with the wildfire raging, the pockets of violence escalating, and the underlying famine tensions, the entire city threatened to devour itself. In a grim irony, the faith militant's aspiration to unify the realm under the Seven had sparked an inferno of desperation. Back in the Red Keep, Cersei reached Tommen, who was guarded by only a few faith soldiers. Ser Robert Strong made short work of them, tearing one man's head from his shoulders. Tommen screamed in horror. Cersei grabbed her son by the arm, ignoring his trembling protests. "Come with me," she hissed. "We must flee this cursed city. Do you understand?" He was too stunned to reply, yet he let her drag him away, half in shock, half in relief that his mother was there to save him. By the time the High Sparrow realized what was happening in the Red Keep, Cersei and Tommen were gone, escorted through a secret passage by Ser Robert Strong and Qyburn's loyalists. Where they would go was uncertain, perhaps to the distant seat of Casterly Rock, or maybe to join with any Lannister or Tyrell forces who might shelter them. In any case, Tommen was now out of the Faith's grasp, the ultimate symbol of their victory slipping through their fingers. Inside the Great September, as the chaos grew, someone shouted that Lannister men had placed wildfire beneath the sept itself. A tremor of absolute panic coursed through the masses, and they began scrambling for the exits, trampling one another. In the swirling hysteria, the High Sparrow stood stoic in the central aisle, arms raised to the statues of the Seven, praying aloud. "Father, judge us justly. Mother, protect us. Warrior, grant us courage." But it was unclear if the rumored wildfire had truly been placed or if it was just fear speaking. Outside, the city's skyline glowed a hellish green in places, with black smoke blotting out the afternoon sun. Theoden stumbled through the madness, leading a band of faith militant and a few city watchmen who had joined them, trying to quell fires, rescue the trapped, restore some semblance of order. Here and there he succeeded, but for every street he cleared, another was consumed by flames or riots. Bodies lay strewn amid the cobblestones, some charred, some hacked by blades. Grief-stricken survivors wailed for lost family. More than once, Theoden nearly lost his life in the swirling melee, battered by debris or nearly trampled by a mob. Yet he pressed on. Eventually, he could do no more. The city was beyond immediate salvation. He and his band retreated toward the Red Keep, hoping to at least secure the seat of power. But once they reached the keep's gates, they found them broken open, faith guards lying dead. The courtyard was overrun by a mixture of desperate small folk and lawless men. The stragglers from the faith militant put up a defense, but the chaos was too widespread. In the end, King Theoden found himself forced to make a decision: remain in the city or escape while he still lived. The monarchy he had tried to embody was collapsing under the weight of the faith's fanaticism and the Lord's wrath. If he stayed, he might be cut down by any number of desperate factions. If he fled, he might live to try to salvage what remained. But where to go? The faith militant had nowhere near the power outside the city that they had within it. An acrid wind blew across the courtyard, carrying ashes on the breeze. Theoden looked around, seeing men wailing in despair, a woman kneeling beside the body of her child. Green flames licked the eastern walls. A half-collapsed tower belched black smoke. The stench was of burnt flesh and scorched stone. Tears blurred Theoden's vision. This was not what the Seven had willed. He could not believe it. It was man's cruelty and pride that had brought them here. The faith's refusal to yield, the Lord's desire for power, the city's thirst for vengeance. All had culminated in this apocalypse. At last, Theoden sank to his knees, ignoring the danger around him. He prayed to the Seven, not for victory, but for forgiveness. He prayed for the souls lost that day, for the city torn apart by hatred and fear. He did not notice the man creeping up behind him, a gaunt figure in ragged gold and red livery, face smeared with soot and desperation. Perhaps the man had once served the Lannisters or was just a looter wearing stolen garb. It hardly mattered. He saw Theoden kneeling in that courtyard, recognized the simple wooden crown upon his head, and raised a bloody dagger. A shout from a faith militant brother warned Theoden at the last instant. The king turned, sword half lifted, but too late. The dagger plunged into his side. Agony shot through him. He lashed out reflexively, driving his assailant back, but the damage was done. As he collapsed to the courtyard stones, Theoden felt darkness creeping in. The Faith Militant who remained rushed the attacker, killing him on the spot. They tried to stanch their king's wound, but the flow of blood was heavy. A coldness settled over Theoden's limbs. He gazed up at the swirling smoke overhead, the flickering red and green glow of the city's destruction. Dimly, he thought he heard the toll of a distant bell, or perhaps it was just the roar of flames. The Faith Militant bent over him, tears in their eyes, calling him Your Grace, and praying for the warrior to spare him. He coughed, tasted blood, and realized he would not rise from that spot. His last thought was of the people he had failed, of Marjorie's question, was he truly a king or just a puppet? Elsewhere, pockets of King's Landing still burned as the night wore on. The High Sparrow, alone inside the Great September after the crowds had fled, prayed ceaselessly. Whether there was wildfire beneath those stones or not, it scarcely mattered. The city was lost to an orgy of violence and flame. The faith he had carried might burn with it, or might rise from the ashes. Only the future would tell. But for that night, at least, the dream of a holy monarchy died alongside hundreds, perhaps thousands, of souls. And Tommen Baratheon, spirited away by his mother, would live to see a realm thrown into further chaos. Whether he would ever reclaim his crown was uncertain, just as uncertain as whether House Tyrell or any other power would manage to impose order on the smoldering ruins of the capital. The Faith Militant had deposed the Boy King, installing one of their own, but in doing so, they had unleashed forces they could no longer contain. In the end, the city would remember that day as the hour of the Seven's wrath, and perhaps also the hour of man's darkest folly, when piety and ambition fused into a single, cataclysmic force that consumed all in its path. Smoke lingered in the air and clung to the sky as though it might remain there forever. Even after the great columns of green fire began to sputter and die, the stench of wildfire and charred flesh turned the night into an endless nightmare. The howling of wounded men, the wailing of mothers who clutched their dying children, and the crackling roar of collapsing timber all bled together into a single tumultuous dirge. King's Landing had been consumed by madness, and every face that still wandered the smoldering streets looked as though it peered out of a circle of hell. In the debris-laden courtyard of the Red Keep, King Theoden Wells lay sprawled atop blood-slick stones, breathing in shallow gasps. A group of Faith Militant knelt around him, frantic hands pressed to the wound in his side. The man who had stabbed him lay dead within arm's reach, his face fixed in a final grimace. Now, Theoden's own face was pale, and his eyelids fluttered as though he were fighting off sleep. "Your Grace," one of the Faith Militant pleaded, voice trembling. "Stay awake. The warrior's strength flows through you. We will find a maester." A strangled cough wrenched from Theoden's throat. His vision blurred, and for an instant he glimpsed the courtyard as though through a haze of torchlight. Flames danced at the edges of his sight, reflecting weirdly on the spattered metal of Faith armor. The men around him looked terrified, all illusions of religious invincibility gone. They were young and old, commoners from the streets or minor knights who had once pinned their hopes on the High Sparrow's promise of a purified realm. Now, with their newly crowned king bleeding out beneath a ruinous sky, they realized how fragile their cause was. "Leave me," Theoden wheezed at last. "This city is lost." But his men wouldn't leave him. They stayed, pressing rags to the wound, calling out for help to any who passed. Some of the fleeing small folk scarcely spared them a glance. Others paused to spit or shout curses at the Faith for bringing such calamity upon them. No one in that courtyard seemed a hero, and few could even agree on a villain. They were trapped in a swirl of death. Despite his shock and blood loss, Theoden's mind drifted to the memory of Marjorie's last words to him, accusing him of being a puppet. And as he lay there, he thought also of Tommen. Tommen, who was just a boy, so gentle. Had Theoden done better for the realm by deposing him, or had he simply traded one heartbreak for another, stoking chaos rather than banishing it? The cracks in his faith widened further, letting in a flood of regret. One of the Faith Militant pulled Theoden's arm around his shoulders, trying to lift him, urging another brother to help. Theoden's head lolled back. He barely felt his own limbs. He blinked once, remembering the shape of the Iron Throne, that monstrous seat of fused swords. He had hated it from the moment he first sat upon it, the metal biting into his shoulders. "Get him inside," gasped a faith brother. "Hurry, we can barricade ourselves in a wing. Protect his grace until we find a maester." A handful of them stumbled forward, carrying Theoden's weight in a makeshift litter of broken spear shafts and cloaks. Step by clumsy step, they crossed the blood-soaked courtyard, heading toward a side entryway of the Red Keep. This smaller door was miraculously unbreached. Shouts rang out from other corners. There were pockets of fighting, stray bands of looters, and the ever-present fires. The Faith Militant posted a sentry at the door, then vanished inside with their limp king. Within, the corridors echoed with emptiness. The walls were streaked with soot and debris, the air acrid from distant fires. Dust and drifting smoke dulled the once glittering torches. The Faith escort, each man's face grim, found a small audience chamber on the keep's lower level. They set Theoden down on a long wooden table that was half broken, a relic from some previous skirmish that night. One man raced off to find a maester, if any still lived and hadn't fled. Others hovered near Theoden, reciting prayers under their breath, though desperation cracked their voices. When at last a maester did appear, an older man with a blood-stained chain around his neck, he looked both horrified and resigned to the carnage. He rushed to Theoden, carefully moving the king's armor aside, frowning at the wound. "He must be tended to immediately," the maester said. "But I need boiling water, bandages, something to sew with, and light. I can barely see in this gloom." Some of the Faith Militants scattered to gather supplies. The old man set about cutting away Theoden's tunic, revealing a deep slash that oozed dark blood. "Hold him still," the maester muttered. "This will be painful." Theoden barely felt the needle, the compresses of hot cloth, the stinging of ointment pressed into open flesh. He drifted in and out of awareness, occasionally spasming with raw agony. Each time his eyes snapped open, he saw flickers of men with the seven-pointed star across their breasts, the ceiling's rafters blackened by soot, a single torch guttering on the wall, or a swirl of shapeless shadows. At some point, the old maester forced a bitter elixir down Theoden's throat to dull the pain. He swallowed reflexively, then drifted away again into feverish half-sleep. When consciousness returned in any measure, he was propped against the table's edge, feeling as though a hammer had beaten his entire body. Outside, the corridor was quieter, though the distant roar of chaos remained. Every breath brought a lance of agony in his side. A heavy bandage had been wrapped around his torso. The maester stood nearby, rummaging through a small kit of supplies. "How long have I?" Theoden mumbled, not even sure how to finish the question. "A few hours," the maester answered without looking up. "Though time is difficult to measure this night." Through the half-open door, Theoden heard men speaking in frantic whispers. Faith Militant who had come and gone to scavenge food or water, or to chase away groups of looters from the Red Keep's perimeter. Some had returned with dreadful reports. Wildfire still burned in pockets of the city. The Great September was rumored to be half abandoned, and the High Sparrow's whereabouts uncertain. The Tyrell encampment outside the city walls had made no formal move yet, perhaps stunned by the catastrophe within. Meanwhile, small folk were fleeing the capital in droves. Any who couldn't flee resorted to barricading themselves inside buildings. The city's watchers were nowhere to be found, and no recognized authority reigned in the streets. Against that backdrop, Theoden realized, if any figure of leadership remained, it was him, wounded as he was, and the High Sparrow if he still lived. But Theoden felt no triumph at the thought. He felt only a bone-deep sorrow, recalling the bright hopes he'd carried when he first accepted the crown. He had wanted to unify the realm, to help the poor, to set a gentler example than the arrogance of the old lords. Now, the realm was less united than ever. The poor lay dead in the streets, and he had unwittingly become the face of the faith's uncompromising dogma. He wanted nothing more than to tear the wooden crown from his head. or better yet, never to have worn it in the first place. Gradually, he mustered enough will to shift himself upright. The pain made his vision momentarily black out, and he slumped back, sweat beading on his brow. The maester muttered that he needed rest, that opening the wound again would surely kill him. But Theoden insisted. "I must learn what's happening," he managed. "Help me stand." Two of the faith militant men came forward, gently lifting him. His legs threatened to give way. He planted a trembling hand on a battered chair for support. The older maester frowned severely. "You will tear your stitches, your grace. I beg you." "I cannot lead from a table," Theoden rasped. He hobbled, leaning on a soldier, out into the corridor. What he saw was a small cluster of faith men, no more than 8 or 10, half of them wounded themselves. At the far end of the corridor, a body in a red cloak sprawled face down, a crossbow bolt in the back. Smoke drifted in lazy tendrils from an open window, but no immediate flames threatened this part of the Red Keep now. The men bowed their heads at the sight of Theoden, an odd mixture of awe, relief, and fear in their eyes. One of them, a young man with newly shaven hair, stepped forward. "Your Grace," he said in a shaky voice. "We've word from the lower wards. The High Sparrow's last known location was the Great September. Nobody knows if he survived. Fires are running wild along the Street of Sisters. There's talk of more pockets of wildfire, but it may just be panic. Bands of sellswords roam at will." Theoden forced his lips to form words. "We must quell the flames. Gather any survivors we can. Set up triage for the wounded." Sounded so hollow even as he said it. The city was too big, the devastation too widespread, and the faith too reviled after their coup. Still, he had to try. "Can we raise a rallying point? The keep is compromised. Perhaps the courtyard by the stables? Or the square outside the mud gate, if it's not entirely in flames." "Most of the gates are overrun, Your Grace," said another soldier. "I don't know how we'd even send men to organize that. And the people, they hate us now. They blame the faith for everything." "They have cause," Theoden answered quietly, pressing a hand to his throbbing side. "But we must try. Find any city watch we can who might cooperate. If they still want an end to the anarchy, we can work with them. Secure the gates. Let the small folk flee if they wish." "What of the Lannisters? Or the Tyrell men?" asked the shaved-headed faith man. "If we open the gates, their armies might pour in." Theoden hesitated, remembering the blockade, the tensions with House Tyrell. But at this point, it hardly mattered. The city was devouring itself from the inside. If an army arrived to impose order, could that be worse? "So be it," he said at last. "If they come, we'll meet them without hostility, unless they come to slaughter us. But so long as the city burns, we must set aside grudges. The realm has endured too much bloodshed. Please, I beg you, do what you can. I will join you when I'm able." He slumped against the wall, and the men nodded, though their faces betrayed doubt. One by one, they set off to carry out his instructions, some heading deeper into the keep to gather more arms, others venturing cautiously into the Red Keep's outer wards, where small enclaves of faith militants still tried to hold ground against looters. Only a handful remained behind to guard their king. Hours melted away. Dawn threatened to break, but the sky over King's Landing remained dim and choked with smoke. The horizon was tinted a sickly greenish yellow from the lingering fumes of the wildfire. At intervals, Theoden heard distant explosions as hidden caches of the old Mad King's substance ignited. He pressed his eyes shut each time, feeling the reverberation in his bones. Every new explosion might herald the death of scores of innocents. Eventually, Theoden gleaned more news. Cersei Lannister had indeed escaped, along with Tommen. The faith militants' hold on Tommen had been undone with shocking swiftness. That was the final blow to any illusions of control. The king, or ex-king, who had once been so gentle, was now gone, spirited away to an unknown refuge. Perhaps the Tyrells had him. Perhaps House Lannister's soldiers had cut a path out of the city. Rumors abounded, but none had solid proof. The High Sparrow, no one could confirm his fate. Some said a group of devout brothers had led him away from the sept at the last moment, but others claimed they saw him vanish into the swirling smoke as the wildfire threatened to engulf the holy building. And Marjorie Tyrell was nowhere to be found in the Red Keep. Had she seized the chance to slip out as well, or had she perished in the chaos? Amid all this uncertainty, Theoden found himself in a strange limbo of kingship. He was still nominally the crowned ruler by the Faith's decree, but the Faith's leadership was shattered, their numbers drastically reduced, their moral authority in tatters. He had no small council, no alliances with powerful lords, no treasury to speak of. All he had were a few dozen men still loyal to him personally, and possibly some scattered pockets of faithful around the city who hadn't yet given up hope. In practical terms, the monarchy in King's Landing had collapsed. Theoden might have declared himself king of the ashes and it would have rung hollow. Yet he continued to command those around him to do what good they could. Through the day, they found and doused smaller flames in the Red Keep. They set up rudimentary barricades at corridor junctures, trying to keep out marauders and keep in supplies. They evacuated pockets of small folk who'd taken refuge within the keep's walls, guiding them to safer corridors or out through lesser-known sally ports so they could leave the city. While doing so, Theoden had to rest frequently, bracing himself against columns or benches until the waves of pain receded. The wound in his side burned, each step shooting agony. The maester warned him he would reopen it if he continued this way. Around midday, Theoden found himself in a dim corridor overlooking the Blackwater Bay. Outside the window, the water glinted with a sickly sheen, marred by drifting wreckage from some half-sunken galleys. The city's wharves, visible in the distance, teemed with refugees clamoring to find boats. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the heartbreak wash through him. This was his realm, or so the Faith had declared. Yet he felt more akin to a helpless observer in a tragedy. A soft step behind him made him turn sharply, ignoring the pain it caused. A woman stood there in a hooded cloak, half her face hidden by the cloth. A pair of Faith militant guards hovered behind her, uncertain whether to bar her path or not. Theoden recognized the woman's posture, a certain quiet poise. Only when she lifted her head did the torchlight reveal Marjorie Tyrell's features. Her hair was disheveled, her cheeks smudged with ash, but her eyes were steady. "You," he began, baffled. "How did you?" One of the Faith men spoke up. "She appeared at the outer door, Your Grace. Alone. Said she wanted to speak with you. We thought it best to bring her in." Marjorie drew back her hood, revealing the full extent of the soot on her face. She looked exhausted, though a fierce glimmer burned in her gaze. "I had the chance to flee during the chaos," she said quietly. "I tried to find Tommen, but he was gone. I followed the tunnels, saw the destruction from inside and out. There was no point in escaping if it meant going blindly into a city overtaken by mobs." She gave a bitter laugh. "So here I am." The captive queen returned to her captors. Theoden beckoned the guards to leave them, which they did, though they stood watch at a corner not far away. Alone now, the two faced each other in the dim corridor. For a long moment, neither spoke. King and queen, though neither truly held their titles in any real sense. Marjorie's eyes flicked to the bandage visible beneath Theoden's partially open cloak. "You're hurt," she said softly. He gave a brief nod. "A would-be Avenger's dagger. It won't kill me right this instant, but it might yet. The city is—" He swallowed against the ache. "Everything is undone." Marjorie exhaled, turning to gaze out the window at the ruined skyline. "Is the High Sparrow truly dead?" "I don't know," Theoden admitted. "And if he lives, I'm not sure it makes a difference. The Faith militant are broken. The small folk are in revolt or fleeing. Cersei and Tommen are gone. House Tyrell's men still surround the city, but they seem to be waiting, perhaps as shocked as everyone else." She lowered her eyes. "My family will demand I be brought to safety if they attack. But with wildfire destroying half the city, I'm not even certain an attack is feasible. My father might try to hold out, see if the Faith devours itself." A humorless shrug. I never imagined it would end like this. I always believed I could guide Tommen to be a good king, that we could find a better path for the realm. But now he's carried off. And you ended up with a crown you never wanted, presiding over a city in ashes." A pause fell. In that silence, they both heard distant screams echoing across the keep's corridors. Another fire must have flared, or more violence erupted. Theoden closed his eyes momentarily. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that sounds feeble now, but I truly am. If I had known it would come to this, I never would have let the High Sparrow convince me. I wanted to help, to show mercy." Marjorie studied him. Beneath the caked soot and the lines of exhaustion, her face held an expression of regret too. "If I had known the faith would seize Tommen, maybe I could have prevented it. Spoken differently, negotiated earlier. Perhaps none of us truly foresaw how extreme it would become." She pressed her lips together. "But regrets don't save us now. The city is in ruins, and thousands are dead. If we don't act, more will die." Theoden nodded, wincing at the pain. "You're right. I've sent men to quell fires, but we have so few left. Many blame us for the coup. They won't listen. The city watch is scattered or in hiding. The Tyrells could bring in an organized host to restore order, but they might also treat every faith militant as an enemy and cut them down." He looked at her carefully. "Will you speak to them if we can get word to your father or grandmother? Help me broker a truce, so we can save what's left of King's Landing." Marjorie's expression flickered with tension. "You're asking me to do the same thing I tried before all this chaos, only now the city is half destroyed. My family might show no mercy after what's happened to me, or to Tommen. They'll want the High Sparrow's head, and maybe yours as well." She paused, then added in a softer voice, "Yet if you truly want to save the people, then I can't refuse to try. The city needs leadership, and with Tommen gone and the faith in disarray, House Tyrell stands to become the most stable force. Perhaps we can make them see reason." Theoden's relief was tempered by the knowledge of how precarious their position was. "Thank you. I wish I could ride out with you, but in my state, you'd likely die," she said, blunt but not without sympathy. "Even if I carried a white flag, men would see your faith armor and think you the cause of all this. We need to handle this carefully." They hashed out a plan in hushed tones, leaning over a wooden windowsill as though conspirators. They agreed that Marjorie would be allowed to leave the Red Keep under the faith's protection, but also with a show of neutrality, a plain garment, no crown. She would walk to the city gates, or as close as she could get, carrying a visible sign of truce. Theoden would remain behind with the handful of faith militants still loyal to him, focusing on preventing further destruction in the keep and along the approach to the main city gates. If Marjorie successfully reached the Tyrell lines, she would plead for a cessation of hostilities, some measure of cooperation to feed the survivors, put out fires, and restore order. In return, Theoden was willing to yield the city if it meant saving lives, though he had no illusions the faith would remain in power. The faith militant might become hunted men, or perhaps forced into humiliating surrender. But better that than more death. As they set the details, Theoden studied Marjorie's face and realized she was perhaps the only person left who could accomplish such a feat. She was cunning, beloved by much of the small folk, at least before the faith's takeover, and her family's loyalty was absolute. If anyone could parley a battered city into a chance at survival, it was her. He only prayed that House Tyrell would listen, that they wouldn't simply cut her off or use her as a rallying cry for vengeance. When the plan was set, they parted with a certain solemn understanding. Marjorie was escorted to a small storage chamber deep in the keep to find suitable clothing, and the faith militant who would guard her on the approach readied themselves. Theoden insisted that it be a small escort, perhaps only 2 or 3 men. Too large a group would look threatening. Too small, though, and roving mobs might kill her before she made it to the gates. In the end, they settled on 3. A pious but steady-handed knight named Ser Olivar, and 2 devoted commoners who had proven themselves calm in a crisis. An hour later, with the sun hidden behind a haze of smoke, Marjorie Tyrell set out. She wore a plain gray cloak that concealed the finery she once donned as queen, her hair tucked away, face marked by soot. She carried a white scrap of cloth tied around a stick as a makeshift flag of truce. Ser Olivar and his two companions flanked her, each holding a cudgel or a sword, though they kept their weapons lowered. Theoden watched them descend the keep's outer steps into the wide courtyard, which was strewn with rubble. From his vantage behind a crenel, he could see the cityscape. Scattered fires still glowed, sending columns of black smoke into the sky. The clang of distant steel told him that pockets of violence continued unabated. The small party slipped through a ruined gatehouse, leaving the Red Keep's domain behind. Theoden could do nothing but wait, leaning heavily on a stone, the pain in his side pulsing. He prayed, truly prayed, to the Seven for Marjorie's safe passage, for the small folk not to tear her apart, for the Tyrells to open their ears. Whether the gods cared after this ruin, he had no idea. But it was all he could do. The journey through the war-torn streets was harrowing. Marjorie kept her head lowered, though she tried to stay alert for sudden threats. Burned timbers jutted out from collapsed shops, the air thick with acrid dust. Bodies lay in heaps or singly along the edges of the road, some bearing the star sigil of the faith, others in gold cloaks, still others in no uniform at all. She saw a mother hunched over a child's body, sobbing. She saw a once grand house with its doors smashed in, looters carrying out anything that might be sold. Through it all, she gripped her white scrap of cloth. She had never witnessed such devastation up close, not even when Stannis had attacked King's Landing in the War of the Five Kings. That had been terrifying, but it felt contained compared to this total collapse of order. At one intersection, a group of ragged men emerged from behind an overturned cart. They carried makeshift weapons, clubs, rusty knives. Their eyes shone with desperation. They must have recognized the Faith Militant star on Ser Olivar's tabard, for they approached with hostility. "You bastards ruined us," one man shouted. "We starve because of you. Look at my family." He pointed at two children cowering behind the cart, their faces gaunt and covered in grime. Another man hefted his club. "Let's kill them," he snarled. "And that fancy lady too. They ain't done a thing for us." Ser Olivar lifted a hand, urging calm, though his own posture was tense. Marjorie, heart hammering, pulled back her hood to reveal herself. "Wait!" she cried. "I'm Marjorie Tyrell. I've come to negotiate an end to this nightmare. We're on our way to bring help. Food, medicine, whatever can be found." The men froze, blinking in astonishment. Some recognized her name, perhaps remembering the times she had distributed bread in Flea Bottom. A murmur rose among them. One spat. "Tyrell? The ones blockading the city? The ones starving us with their demands?" "It was never my wish to starve anyone," Marjorie said, her voice cracking. "But I need your help now. Let us pass, and I swear we will bring relief if we can. My family is outside the walls. I'm trying to broker peace. I'm not with the faith. I'm only escorted so I can reach the gates safely." For a tense moment, the men glanced at each other. The children behind the cart peered wide-eyed, uncertain. Then, grudgingly, one of them lowered his club. "Go," he muttered. "But if you fail to bring relief, the next time we see you, we won't hesitate." Marjorie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ser Olivar guided her forward, his hand close to his sword but not drawing it. As they continued on, she felt the men's eyes burning into her back. She prayed that her vow to bring help wouldn't prove hollow. Further on, they encountered more carnage. Roofs collapsed in swirling ash, half-burnt corpses. At least some pockets of the city had begun to calm as exhaustion took hold. Rioters had run short on energy or found corners to hide in. The clang of swords was replaced here and there by an eerie quiet, broken only by crackling embers and distant weeping. The party steeled themselves until they reached a wide thoroughfare leading to the city gates. A barricade of wagons and broken furniture blocked the approach. A ragtag group of city watch wearing battered gold cloaks, some missing their boots or half their armor, stood behind it, looking as defeated as the rest of the city. When they saw Marjorie, they muttered among themselves. One stepped forward. "You there, what do you want? This area's closed off." "I must reach the Tyrell encampment," she said, again showing her makeshift white flag. "I carry an offer of truce. Let me pass." The watchmen exchanged uneasy glances. Their eyes roamed across the Faith escort. "We have orders from no one," said a sergeant, a stocky man with a patchy beard. "Most of our officers are dead or fled. We're just trying to keep more looters from leaving the city with everything that's not nailed down." He paused. "But if you want out, you can try the main gate. Good luck, my lady. If the Tyrells see that Faith Star, they might shoot you on sight. Word is, the Tyrell soldiers are furious." Marjorie refused to be daunted. "I must attempt it. The people are starving. Please move your barricade." The watchman sighed, clearly reluctant to waste effort, but they did as she asked. Two men shoved aside an overturned wagon enough for Marjorie and her escort to slip through. After that, the gate itself loomed, battered but still largely intact, with a heavy portcullis lowered. A pair of watchmen milled about in confusion. They recognized Marjorie as she approached, or at least recognized she was highborn. "Open the gate," she said, her tone carrying the weight of one who was once a queen. "In the name of the small folk who yet live." They hesitated, but eventually a man cranked a mechanism that began lifting the portcullis. Clouds of ash and dust swirled in from outside. The moment the gap was wide enough, Marjorie, Ser Olivar, and the other two Faith men ducked under, stepping into the open ground between the walls and the Tyrell lines. Only a short distance beyond the ruined fields and ditches, the green and gold banners of Highgarden fluttered, though even they seemed dulled by the pall of smoke overhead. Instantly, horns sounded in the Tyrell camps. A line of spearmen pressed forward, forming a bristling hedge of steel points aimed in her direction. Marjorie raised her flag high, calling out, "Parley! Parley!" Ser Olivar and the others halted, swords sheathed, hands out in plain view. An arrow whistled over their heads, burying itself in the ground as a warning. Marjorie's heart pounded, but she didn't waver. Within moments, an officer of the Tyrell host rode forward on a horse. "In the name of House Tyrell, halt!" he barked. Then his gaze fell on Marjorie's face, and he froze in shock. "Gods! Lady Marjorie!" She lowered the cloth that hid part of her face. "Yes," she said, relieved that she recognized him. "Ser Desmond, a bannerman from a minor branch of House Tyrell. I have come from the city. I must speak with my father or grandmother immediately. Lives depend on it." Ser Desmond hesitated, eyeing the Faith men behind her. "Those men, are you a hostage?" "They serve only to protect me on the road," Marjorie answered. "They will remain outside your camp if you wish, but let me speak to my family." He nodded, swallowing his surprise. "This way." He turned and gestured for the line of spearmen to part. Marjorie, with a quick backward glance at Ser Olivar, nodded for him and the other two to stay put. "Wait here," she said softly. "If you enter with me, it might provoke them." Ser Olivar grudgingly agreed. He and his companions stood in the open field, tension brimming, uncertain if the Tyrell archers might fire on them at any moment. Marjorie walked on alone, unarmed, following Ser Desmond. She realized with a pang that while she might be safer here than among the chaos in King's Landing, the next hour could determine the fate of everyone left in the city. They reached the main Tyrell encampment, row upon row of green and gold tents. Soldiers bustled about, some cooking meager rations, others tending horses. The blockade had gone on for some time, and the atmosphere was edgy. The men recognized her presence, halting in astonishment. Whispers spread like wildfire. "The Queen is alive! Lady Marjorie's returned." Several men bowed or doffed their helms, though an undercurrent of anxiety ran through them. They had no idea what she'd endured inside the city. She was guided to the largest pavilion, where Mace Tyrell, her father, was pacing with a half-dozen knights in earnest discussion. Nearby, Lady Olenna Tyrell sat in a high-backed chair, her cane resting across her lap. When Marjorie appeared in the doorway, Lady Olenna jolted upright, eyes widening. Mace spun around, mouth agape. A stunned hush fell upon everyone present. "Marjorie!" Mace exclaimed, rushing forward. He opened his arms as though to hug her, but then saw the grime, the ash, the bruises. He halted, face contorted. "Seven, save us, are you harmed? Where is Tommen?" Lady Olenna stood more slowly, but her eyes glimmered with unspoken relief. "Child," she murmured, her usual sharp tongue subdued for just an instant. "Thank the gods you're alive. We feared the worst." Marjorie tried to muster composure, though tears of exhaustion stung her eyes. "Father, grandmother," she said, "I'm safe for the moment, but there's not much time. Tommen is gone, spirited away by Cersei, from what I can tell. The city is in chaos, half of it burned by wildfire. The High Sparrow's men have lost control. King's Landing is all but destroyed, and thousands are dead or dying." She paused, taking a ragged breath. "I have come to beg for your help. The blockade has turned the small folk against House Tyrell, but the faith militant is now broken. There's a chance to restore order if the Tyrell army enters the city as peacekeepers, not as conquerors. If we can feed the survivors, put out the remaining fires, ensure security, we might save tens of thousands more from perishing. But you must come now with bread, with leadership, and with mercy." Mace Tyrell looked thunderstruck. "The faith seized you. They humiliated you, cast out your husband. Why should we show them mercy? They deserve the headsman's block." Lady Olenna clicked her tongue. "I'll decide who deserves what," she muttered. Then, to Marjorie, "If we march in by force, we'll have to fight what remains of the faith and any loyalists. That could cost more lives, especially if the city is still riddled with hidden caches of wildfire. We may lose more than we save. That's why we need to approach carefully," Marjorie said. "I've spoken to their so-called King Theoden. He's gravely wounded. He's ready to surrender the city, effectively. All he wants is for someone to keep it from falling further into ruin. He has only a handful of men left." Mace frowned. "This Theoden was the upstart they placed on Tommen's throne?" "Yes," Marjorie answered. "But he is not the High Sparrow. He's a knight who was manipulated into this madness. In truth, I believe he wants the same thing we do now, an end to the bloodshed. If you come in peace, we can avoid a last stand. The people will not resist you if you bring them food and safety." Lady Olenna's face hardened. "I never imagined the day would come that we used House Tyrell's armies to rescue the rabble who supported those barefoot fanatics. But the alternative is letting the realm's capital become a graveyard. That would serve no one's interests, least of all ours. Still, a question remains. What of Tommen's rightful claim to the throne? With him vanished, who rules?" Marjorie had no easy answer. In the immediate sense, the city must be stabilized. After that, if we find Tommen, we can discuss his restoration. Or if he is beyond our reach, the great houses might declare a new claimant. But first, let's ensure there is a city left to rule. Mace looked at his mother, uncertain. Lady Olenna steepled her fingers on her cane. "We'll do it," she said at length, her tone decisive. "We'll march in and quell the chaos, feed the survivors. But I will not suffer any illusions about letting the High Sparrow or his top zealots escape justice. The city is ours, effectively, once we enter. That means we set the terms." Marjorie nodded. "I understand. They can't object if they're powerless. But there are innocents still wearing the star who only joined out of desperation. We should show some leniency, or else we'll never mend the realm's wounds." Lady Olenna's mouth curved in a slight smile, one devoid of humor. "Mercy, yes, but we'll keep the option of the headsman's axe for those most responsible." She turned to Mace. "Summon the captains. Prepare rations. We march as soon as possible, at first light tomorrow if the city remains stable enough. We'll move in columns, with enough men to deter any pockets of resistance." Mace nodded, though he still looked overwhelmed. "Yes, Mother. My dear Marjorie, I'm so glad you're safe. We'll do what must be done." Marjorie forced a weary smile, letting him enfold her in a cautious hug. The grime on her cloak left a sooty smear on Mace's tunic. She closed her eyes, feeling relief at having reached her family, but also dread at the knowledge that the city might burn further overnight. She wanted them to act immediately, but the Tyrell host was no small force to move on a whim, and the risk of unseen wildfire was real. Still, if an extra day's delay cost more lives, the blame would fall on them as well. She spent the next hours trying to convince her grandmother that they should move sooner, but Lady Olenna insisted they couldn't march in the dead of night over broken fields and rubbled roads. Soldiers needed some rest, and scouts had to ensure that the approach into the city wasn't lined with traps. Marjorie thought of the mothers and children she had seen, of the men who had threatened her in the street out of desperation, of the bodies that would pile higher if help was delayed. She felt helpless to speed the process, so instead she helped direct the gathering of bread and water. At the very least, rations could be prepared for immediate distribution once they entered. That night, she slept fitfully in a cot under her grandmother's pavilion, haunted by images of burning streets. She dreamt of Tommen's face, frightened and gentle, calling her name. She dreamt of Theoden, bandaged and alone in the Red Keep, and for a fleeting moment she felt pity for him. He might have done more to stop the High Sparrow from unleashing tyranny, but he'd also tried to do good in the end. Despite everything, she wished him no further harm. Dawn arrived with a grayish hue. No clear sunrise, just a gradual lightening of the smoky sky. Mace Tyrell's captains arrayed the men into orderly columns, each carrying provisions. Carts laden with bread and barrels of water trundled along. Gaps in the blockade were opened to allow the army forward. Marjorie rode with Lady Olenna near the front, flanked by a strong guard. They advanced cautiously across the scorched fields that ringed King's Landing. The imposing walls of the city looked grim, with black smudges around parapets and towers that had partially collapsed. No archers greeted them, no sign of any organized defense. The gates were still raised from Marjorie's departure the day before. A few City Watch stragglers gawked at the approach of the Tyrell host, uncertain whether they should flee or open the gate further. Lady Olenna sent a herald forward, calling out that they came to restore peace under the authority of House Tyrell, that no harm would come to small folk or watchmen who laid down their arms. Initially, the watchmen looked skeptical, but soon they realized they were in no position to resist a well-organized force of thousands. Thus, the Tyrell column entered the city. The stench of death and char rose to greet them. Soldiers lifted cloths to their mouths, muttering curses at the devastation. They saw entire stretches of scorched buildings, heaps of rubble where side streets had caved in or were blocked by collapsed structures. Here and there, survivors peered from alley corners or behind shuttered windows. Mace Tyrell ordered the distribution of rations, sending small squads to fan out. Each squad carried bread and water, flanked by armed men to deter attacks. Some of the starving small folk rushed forward in desperation, and there were scuffles, but generally the presence of disciplined soldiers kept order from collapsing again. Amid the heartbreak, Marjorie felt a flicker of hope. If they could maintain discipline, they might save many lives. She only prayed that any remaining faith zealots didn't launch suicidal assaults against the Tyrells and reignite widespread violence. As the main body moved deeper toward the Red Keep, Lady Olenna had men systematically check the side streets for hidden caches of wildfire or lurking remnants of the faith militant. Many of the faith had thrown off their tabards, trying to disappear among the populace. Others had been slaughtered by rioters. Only scattered pockets of armed faith men remained. But so far, there was no sign of open confrontation. Eventually, they reached the battered gates of the Red Keep. A group of faith militants stood in front, about 20 in number, battered and weary. Among them was Ser Olivar, who had accompanied Marjorie the previous day. He stepped forth and raised his hands. "We do not seek battle," he called. "We have only protected those within. The king is wounded, but willing to parley." Lady Olenna's lips thinned at the mention of the king. She motioned for the soldiers to hold position, then beckoned Marjorie. "Come, child, we might as well see this puppet for ourselves. Perhaps we can discover if he's playing at any last ruse." They approached under a white flag. The faith militant parted to let them through into the courtyard, where char marks still stained the ground. There, upon a makeshift seat, A high-backed chair pulled from some lesser audience chamber sat Theoden Wells, his face ashen, his side heavily bandaged. He clutched a staff, barely able to support himself if he stood. A ring of anxious faith men lingered around him. When Lady Olenna laid eyes on Theoden, her eyebrows rose. She'd heard of him, of course, but seeing him in this state, so young, worn, and obviously in pain, seemed to take her aback. Marjorie saw a flicker of pity in her grandmother's eyes, quickly replaced by flinty resolve. She advanced, leaning on her cane. So, this is the man who sat the Iron Throne for a brief, disastrous moment. Theoden managed a feeble bow of his head. "Lady Olenna," he said, voice hoarse, "I welcome you to the city. I trust you come to save it." The old woman surveyed the courtyard. "Your city is in ashes, your faith militant scattered. I see precious little for you to cede, save for these pathetic lumps in starry tabards. Yet Marjorie insists you want cooperation. Speak quickly if you can." Theoden grimaced at her bluntness, but he seemed too weary to argue. "I have no illusions left," he said. "I am prepared to yield all claim to the throne, to place the city under House Tyrell's protection, so long as you spare these men who remain loyal to me. Most of them are just misguided, not malicious, and so long as you show mercy to the small folk. Provide them with food, care for the wounded. That is all I ask." Lady Olenna studied him closely, perhaps expecting a trap or some hidden zeal. When she found none, she sniffed. "You have no bargaining position, but fortunately for you, the Tyrells have come to salvage what we can. As for your men, provided they cause no more trouble, I see no advantage in slaughtering them. Let them lay down their arms, and we'll let them depart or join the cleanup efforts." Theoden's gaze flicked to the band of faith around him. Some bowed their heads in silent gratitude. Others glowered at Lady Olenna, clearly resentful that the Tyrells would waltz in as saviors. But Theoden nodded. "We thank you." Then, coughing, he shifted in his seat. "As for me, I will relinquish the crown. If you need my help to quell any further violence, I will give it. I only ask that you do not punish me as you would the High Sparrow. I never wanted any of this." Lady Olenna's cane tapped the stones. She glanced at Marjorie. "What do you think, child? Should we let him live? Or do you want his head for supplanting your husband?" Marjorie felt a stab of discomfort at her grandmother's deliberate provocation. She forced a composed expression. "He tried to help me, grandmother, before the city fell apart, and he has surrendered without condition. Killing him now would serve no purpose." The old woman's mouth twitched. "Very well. You may keep your head, Ser Theoden or King Theoden, whatever you style yourself. But know that if you so much as whisper about retaking the throne, I'll have your tongue carved out." She paused, then grudgingly added, "If you have knowledge that can help us quell the city's fires or disarm any leftover traps, share it. We have no patience for secrecy." Theoden inclined his head. "I will tell you all I know about the Faith's strongholds, the possible caches of wildfire that remain. I beg only that we move swiftly to find survivors trapped under rubble. Many are still out there." Lady Olenna nodded. "We plan to. The Tyrell banners will soon fly over the Red Keep once again. My men will take command of the gates, the granaries, and any strategic points. Your men can join the relief efforts under our supervision." Theoden summoned what little strength he had, rising from the makeshift chair with the staff for balance. His face tightened with pain, and Marjorie saw fresh blood seeping through his bandages. But he bowed in deference. "Then, as the last act of my kingship, I name you protectors of King's Landing. May you do better by it than I managed." He turned to the men at his back. "Lay down your arms. Go with them. If any of you prefer, you may take refuge in the seps outside the city or find your way home. But do not fight." A hush followed, broken only by the distant crackle of fires. Slowly, the Faith militants still present lowered their swords and cudgels. They removed their star-marked tabards, letting them fall on the scorched stones. Some wept in anger or sorrow. Others spat curses at no one in particular. A few hurried to Theoden's side, insisting on aiding him, unwilling to abandon their wounded king so easily. But they submitted to Tyrell soldiers who came forward, confiscating weapons. Lady Olenna watched impassively, then jerked her head at some of her own knights to assist Theoden. "Take him to the Maester's tower," she said curtly. "We can't have him dying just yet, not when he might be useful." Marjorie swallowed the lump in her throat. It felt unreal, watching the abrupt end to the Faith's monarchy. Less than 2 months had passed since Tommen was deposed in that humiliating scene at the Iron Throne, and now Theoden stood dethroned, wounded, reduced to a footnote. She remembered how quickly the Faith had risen to power, how unstoppable it had seemed, how they had claimed to wield the authority of the gods themselves. And now it was undone. Undone by pride, by Cersei's cunning and wildfire, and by the unstoppable force of House Tyrell. The cycle of power repeated. One dethroned king replaced by a new faction. Would the realm know any peace? Lady Olenna touched her granddaughter's arm, drawing her attention. "Come, child. There's much to do." So began a tense, grueling process of restoring a modicum of order to King's Landing under Tyrell rule. Over the next days, Lady Olenna and Mace Tyrell oversaw relief efforts. Soldiers put out the last pockets of fire, using bucket chains from the river. They tore down unstable structures, set up camps for the homeless in the city squares, and doled out bread and water under strict supervision. The battered city watch, or what remained of it, were folded into Tyrell command. They patrolled the streets to prevent further looting. The Faith militant who surrendered were detained or assigned to labor brigades, clearing rubble and recovering bodies from collapsed buildings. Marjorie took a leading role in the distribution of food. She went out among the survivors, ensuring that the frightened small folk saw a familiar face. Some still cursed her for the blockade, blaming her family for the starvation. Yet many, especially those who remembered her acts of charity before the coup, fell to their knees in gratitude when she offered them sustenance. She did what she could to keep the peace, though the horror of the aftermath weighed heavily on her. Street after street, she saw wagons piled with corpses, the stench almost unbearable, and each day, more died from infection or injuries sustained during the fires. In the Red Keep, the Tyrell banners replaced the tattered Lannister lion and Baratheon stag. The Iron Throne still stood in the Great Hall, but it seemed more a relic than a seat of genuine power. No one took it upon themselves to sit it permanently, not yet. Word spread that Tommen was alive somewhere, but no confirmation came. The Tyrells were reluctant to declare the throne vacant while Tommen lived, even if they considered him dethroned by the Faith. Politically, it was a thorny question. Lady Olenna stated that, for the moment, the city would be administered by House Tyrell in trust until the matter of succession was sorted. Some whispered that Mace Tyrell might press to have Marjorie declared Queen Regent in Tommen's absence, or else married to another suitable claimant. But that talk was overshadowed by the immediate crisis. And what of Cersei Lannister? No one knew for certain. Rumors abounded that she had gone to Casterly Rock. Or perhaps she had allied with some mercenary company. Qyburn was unaccounted for as well. Cersei's flight meant the Lannisters might reemerge to challenge the Tyrell hold on King's Landing. But, for the moment, the city was too ravaged to become a prize worth fighting for. As the days turned into a fortnight, Theoden Wells lingered in a half-forgotten chamber of the Red Keep, watched over by Tyrell guards. The old maester who had first tended him continued his treatment. Each day, Theoden improved slightly, though the pain in his side persisted. He had no illusions left about his fate. Even if he recovered, what place was there for a dethroned puppet king? Yet the Tyrells had not thrown him into a dungeon. Marjorie visited him once to inquire about any lingering hidden stashes of wildfire or other hazards. He told her all he knew, which was limited, but he did stress that the Faith had never possessed the comprehensive knowledge that the Mad King's pyromancers once held. Whatever caches remained, it was possible no one alive knew their locations. Marjorie accepted this with a grim nod. On that visit, Theoden mustered the courage to speak to her. "My lady," he said quietly, "I do not expect your forgiveness for my part in deposing Tommen, but you must know I never sought to do you harm. If you can find Tommen, perhaps the realm can be mended." She regarded him for a moment, her eyes reflecting a sadness deeper than anger. "I know," she said. "Even if you had refused, the High Sparrow would have found another figurehead. We all made choices that led us here. I pray we can prevent another such tragedy." He inclined his head. "What will become of me?" Marjorie was silent. "I don't know," she admitted at last. "Grandmother wants your testimony against the High Sparrow, if he ever reappears. Beyond that, she sees little use for you. You might be allowed to take the Black and join the Night's Watch, or remain here under guard. Frankly, you might find more peace in the Watch than in a city that will never forget your face." A faint glimmer of relief stirred in him. "Taking the Black, perhaps that is best. I was never meant to be a king." Marjorie nodded. She almost reached out to lay a hand on his arm, as if to give comfort, but she hesitated and drew back. Without another word, she turned and left the chamber. Theoden was left alone with his regrets, and a single guard posted outside the door. For hours, he stared at the cracks in the ceiling, thinking of the horrors he had seen, and the horrors he had unwittingly unleashed. Life in King's Landing settled into a grim routine of survival. The Tyrell presence averted a total collapse, but the city bore a scar that would linger for generations. Thousands were homeless, and disease threatened to break out among the cramped refugee camps. Mace Tyrell and his advisors issued decrees. Half the population would be encouraged to leave the city if they had any means to do so, to ease the strain on resources. Temporary housing would be constructed in the outer fields. Wells were dug. Granaries were seized from wealthy hoarders. One day at a time, the city inched away from the precipice of total devastation. In that time, Marjorie frequently walked among the refugees, wearing a plain gown, guarded by a small retinue. Many recognized her, calling her Queen Marjorie, though she no longer claimed that title officially. She listened to their stories, how the faith militant had terrorized them, how they had watched loved ones die in the wildfire blasts. She offered what meager solace she could, but the burden weighed on her soul. When she returned each night, she would speak with Lady Olenna about the day's troubles, and her grandmother, ever practical, would strategize on how best to ensure House Tyrell's position. Meanwhile, the rest of Westeros stirred. Ravens flew bearing news of King's Landing's downfall, the dethronement of Tommen, the unrecognized King Theoden, and the Tyrell takeover. Some lords saw an opportunity to press claims or old grudges. Others grew wary of House Tyrell's power. The Stormlands were fractious, with no single lord strong enough to unify them. The North, preoccupied with Bolton rule and other threats, paid little heed to the capital's woes. The Iron Islands had their own king to choose. Dorne seethed but remained quiet, apparently content to watch the Lannisters topple. It was an uneasy peace, as if the entire realm held its breath, awaiting the next blow. After several weeks, Marjorie received word that a small Lannister force was spotted near the Rose Road, traveling under a flag of parley. Speculation ran rife. Was Cersei coming to demand the city's return? Or perhaps Kevan Lannister sought a truce? Tension spiked in the Tyrell camp as they braced for a renewed confrontation. But the envoy, when it arrived, was led by Kevan Lannister indeed, Tommen's uncle. He had only a few dozen men with him. They were allowed inside the gates by Tyrell guards, albeit under close watch. Kevan Lannister presented himself to Lady Olenna in the throne room, which had been partly cleared of debris. Mace Tyrell and Marjorie stood by, along with a small retinue of Tyrell knights. Kevan looked haggard, older than his years, weighed down by the humiliations his house had suffered. "My lady," he said with quiet formality, "I come at the behest of my remaining family. We seek Tommen. If he is here, we would have him returned." Lady Olenna cocked an eyebrow. "You think we've hidden him somewhere? He was last seen fleeing with Cersei, as far as we know. Unless you have reason to believe otherwise." Kevan regarded her, reading the truth in her gaze. "We found no sign of him at Casterly Rock or on the roads. It's as if he vanished. Cersei too. We fear the worst. If you have no knowledge of his whereabouts, then perhaps I can only implore you. If you do find him, do not harm him. He is but a boy." Marjorie spoke up. "We harbor no ill will toward Tommen. I was his queen. I care for him. If he reappears, we'll do everything in our power to ensure he's safe." She paused, a flicker of sorrow on her features. "If you locate him, Lord Kevin, let us know. The realm needs stability, not another hidden king stirring up more war." Kevin studied her, his expression softening with regret. "You have my word. We do not seek further conflict, not with the city in such a state." Then his gaze swept over the partially ruined throne room. "How the mighty have fallen," he muttered under his breath. "What of the faith militant, the High Sparrow's murderers? I trust you've executed them." Mace Tyrell let out a derisive snort. "Many are dead or fled. A handful surrendered. The High Sparrow himself is missing. If he shows his face, he'll lose his head." Kevin nodded grimly. "My nephew Lancel was among them. Any word of him?" Lady Olenna shrugged. "Possibly among the dead, or cowering in a ditch somewhere. It's difficult to say, given the scale of the destruction." Kevin's shoulders sagged. "Then our business is concluded for now. House Lannister will not move against you, provided you do not impede our search for Tommen. For the sake of the realm, I hope we find a path to peace." He departed shortly thereafter, leaving the Tyrell leadership pensive. Marjorie wondered if perhaps Cersei and Tommen had died in the wildfire chaos and their bodies simply never recovered. Or maybe Cersei had whisked Tommen to a secret stronghold to bide her time. If the latter were true, no doubt she'd be plotting revenge against the Tyrells and the Faith alike. The next day brought a surprising piece of news. The High Sparrow had been spotted within the city, disguised among the small folk, preaching in the ruins of Flea Bottom. A group of Tyrell soldiers rushed to apprehend him, only to find the man gone by the time they arrived. Whispers spread that he had survived the wildfire by the grace of the Seven, that he now walked barefoot through the charred streets, urging the faithful not to lose hope. Lady Olenna ordered a thorough search. She wanted him captured, tried, and likely executed. But in the labyrinth of King's Landing, with so many refugees streaming in and out, it was nearly impossible to track one old man. Some claimed they had glimpsed him praying over the bodies in a burned-out sept. Then the next day a rumor placed him by the dragon pit, consoling orphans. He was like a ghost. Marjorie overheard soldiers grumbling that many of the small folk still harbored sympathy for the High Sparrow. "They lost everything," one man said, "and he's telling them the Seven will provide, that the lords did this to them. They might hide him if they find him." The Tyrell leadership recognized the threat of renewed fanaticism if the High Sparrow reemerged openly. The city's climate was fragile. It wouldn't take much to spark an uprising against the new occupation. Yet each day that passed without capturing him sowed more uncertainty. Meanwhile, Theoden's strength recovered enough for him to limp around with a cane. He was carefully guarded in a tower room. He spent much of his time in prayer, quiet prayer, not the fiery sermons of the faith. He no longer wore the star or any sign of his brief reign. The wooden crown carved with the Seven's imagery had vanished, though he sometimes dreamed of it, along with nightmares of the wildfire. One afternoon, Marjorie visited him again at Lady Olenna's request. She stood in the doorway, watching as Theoden glanced up from the battered book of prayers on his lap. "My lady," he said quietly, setting the book aside, "you honor me with your presence." She stepped inside, letting the heavy door close behind her. "I've come to inform you of a development. The High Sparrow is rumored to be alive in the city, stirring up trouble. If you know anything of his hiding places, we ask you to share." His eyes flickered with concern. "I've heard the rumors, but I know of no secret lair. If he's alive, he's among the poor, preaching in the open. He could be anywhere." Marjorie studied him, trying to gauge any hidden loyalty. "He once convinced you to sit the throne, to break every tradition. Do you still serve him?" A ghost of a smile, touched with sorrow, crossed Theoden's lips. "I never served him. I believed I served the Seven, but it seems I only served my own naivete. The High Sparrow was a man of convictions, but his refusal to compromise destroyed us all. If you fear I'm still his puppet, rest assured, I am not. She nodded, relieved. My grandmother still wants him seized. The city is too fragile for more fanaticism. People are hungry, desperate, easily swayed by promises of divine justice. We can't allow him to rally them into another uprising. Theoden's jaw tightened. I understand, though I suspect that if he's truly among them, the small folk might hide him. They might see him as their only champion after the horrors they've endured. Champion or not, we have to prevent further bloodshed, Marjorie said. Then her tone softened. The maester tells me you're almost well enough to travel. Have you thought on the night's watch? Grandmother would prefer you gone from King's Landing soon. She fears your presence invites rumors of a faith resurgence. He exhaled, a slow, heavy sound. I have thought on it. It may be best for everyone if I vanish from these halls. At least at the wall, my sins might be forgiven in service. I was a knight once. I can take the black. His gaze fell to the floor. I would go tomorrow if it helps. She hesitated. Once you depart, your name might fade, or it might remain as a cautionary tale. The realm has a short memory for those who fall from power, but the faith's legacy could linger. Either way, I hope you find some measure of peace. He met her eyes, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something like gratitude. You have shown me more kindness than I deserve, given what happened to your husband. Thank you, my lady. I pray you find Tommen alive and unhurt, so the realm might have some measure of order again. She inclined her head in acknowledgement. I'll speak to my grandmother about arranging safe passage for you. It will likely be a small escort to the wall, maybe via ship if we can manage it. The roads are plagued by outlaws. He smiled faintly. I suspect I'll have to rely on the gods for protection, but a few armed men wouldn't hurt. With that, Marjorie departed, leaving Theoden to the hush of his tower room. Each step she took in the corridors reverberated in her mind. Ex-king, soon to be a man of the Night's Watch. A piece of history soon to vanish behind black walls and frosty wind. Lady Olenna wasted no time finalizing the plan. Within 3 days, Theoden Wells was placed on a modest galley at the Blackwater docks, accompanied by a handful of loyal Tyrell guards. Their route would take them north by sea, ultimately to Eastwatch by the Sea. From there, Theoden could ride or walk to Castle Black, present himself as a recruit to the Night's Watch. Few came to bid him farewell, and he made no grand speech. He departed in silence, with a battered trunk of clothing and a single sword that had once been his knightly blade, the only worldly possession he was permitted to keep. Before boarding the ship, he paused at the quay to gaze back at King's Landing. The city's skyline was a jagged silhouette of scorched towers and partial ruins. A choking smog still hung in the air, though not as thick as before. In that moment, Theoden felt tears slip down his cheeks. Not for himself, but for the city he had tried and failed to guide. With a soft exhalation, he turned and limped onto the deck. Soon, the galley's sails caught what little wind was blowing, and they drifted away from the battered capital, bound for the colder shores of the north. Theoden cast one last glance behind him, then closed his eyes, surrendering to an uncertain future. In King's Landing, the Tyrell administration pressed on. They received word that some lords of the Crownlands were coming to pledge fealty, if only to maintain stability and re-establish trade. Fleets from the Reach brought more supplies up the Blackwater Rush. Though progress was slow, the daily funerals became less frequent, and some shops reopened in the less damaged districts. Still, fear haunted the populace. Soldiers warned that pockets of men, claiming to follow the High Sparrow, were roaming the streets at night, daubing messages in blood on walls. The Seven remember, and judgment is coming. Lady Olenna responded by sending roving patrols to arrest suspects and quell any incipient rebellion. One twilight, Marjorie stood on a balcony overlooking the city, thinking of Tommen. Had he escaped to safety with Cersei, or had some brigand murdered them on the road? Each scenario played over in her mind. She also wondered about the future of the throne itself. If Tommen never returned, would the Tyrells name a new king? Would they simply hold the city until a great council could be convened? The realm was in a precarious balance, and beyond the horizon, rumor said Daenerys Targaryen gathered power in Essos, or that Euron Greyjoy menaced the seas, or that the North was embroiled in its own troubles. All these storms threatened to converge. On a whim, she went for a walk through the lower levels of the Red Keep, checking on the storerooms where bread was kept before distribution. As she returned, she noticed a flicker of movement down a disused corridor. Glancing that way, she thought she saw a figure in homespun robes slip out of sight. Her heart thudded. Could it be the High Sparrow, or some leftover faith zealot? She hesitated, then followed, instructing her guards to move quietly. They reached an old sept within the castle, one rarely used except for private devotions. The door was slightly ajar. Marjorie signaled her guards to wait, then eased it open, stepping inside. The chamber was lit by a few thin candles on a makeshift altar. In the wavering light, an old man knelt in prayer, his head bowed, the shadows making his face difficult to see. Marjorie drew in a breath. She recognized the posture, the air of ascetic calm. He spoke without turning around. "You need not fear me, child. I am only a supplicant before the Seven." Her heart pounded. "High Sparrow," she whispered, though she no longer knew if that was indeed his title. "Why have you come here? The Tyrells are searching the city for you." Slowly, he rose and turned, the candlelight illuminating his lined face. He wore tattered robes, his feet bare. His eyes held sorrow, but also a calm acceptance. "I have come to pray for those we lost, to pray for the city I once hoped to save. The gods led me here." Marjorie felt a swirl of anger and pity. "Save? You and your faith militant dethroned my husband, brought ruin upon King's Landing. How can you speak of saving it? How many thousands died because of your refusal to compromise?" He lowered his gaze. "More than you know. My heart grieves for them all. Yet sin had to be confronted. The Seven demanded no less. I only regret that men chose violence and wildfire over redemption." She stared at him, incredulous. "It was your fanaticism that caused this violence. You refused to see Tommen as anything but a pawn of Lannisters and Tyrells. You turned the city against its rightful king, and now we have ashes and corpses. Where is your regret for that? Or do you place all blame on others?" For a moment, a flicker of genuine pain crossed his features. "My regrets are many, child. Yet I believe that the cleansing we began might still bear fruit in the hearts of the humble. The High Septon is but a vessel for the Seven's will. I am old, and my time is nearing an end. But faith endures, even when mortal plans fail." She felt tears threaten to rise, a mixture of fury and weariness. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking. "If my grandmother finds you, she will have you executed. Leave the city, vanish across the sea. Just leave us in peace. Haven't you done enough?" He studied her with a mournful sympathy. "Peace is the Seven's gift, not mine to give, and many souls still cry out for guidance. I cannot abandon them." Marjorie trembled. "So you'll keep fanning the embers of rebellion? More death, more chaos, in the name of your pure faith? I cannot permit that." He closed his eyes briefly. "The truth cannot be stifled forever. But if you must do your duty as a daughter of House Tyrell, I will not resist. I have no illusions about living. My old bones are weary." Marjorie stared at him. She realized with a pang that perhaps he wanted to be caught, wanted to be martyred for the cause. Capturing or killing him would only stoke the small folks' longing for a saintly figure. Yet letting him roam might cause more uprisings. The city was so fragile. Her mind churned with the dilemma. If she summoned the guards, they'd take him away, and Lady Olenna would certainly see him executed. Maybe publicly as a show of dominance. That might spark riots from his devout supporters, or it might finally quell their hopes. But what if it made him a martyr? She drew in a breath, tears welling in her eyes despite her best efforts to remain composed. In that moment, she hated him for forcing such a choice upon her. "High Sparrow," she said, voice trembling. "The realm is weary of bloodshed, If your presence here causes more strife, you doom the very people you claim to protect." He stepped forward slightly, palms out in a gesture of nonviolence. "I have no weapon, no militia. I only have words. If the lords see words as more dangerous than swords, that is their failing." She forced back sobs, closing her eyes for an instant. "You used words to overthrow Tommen. Words to cast your net of fanaticism over the city. Words can kill as surely as wildfire." Then she turned and beckoned her guards inside. They entered, swords drawn. "Take him," Marjorie ordered, her tone carefully controlled. "Quietly, no spectacle. Bring him to my grandmother. We will decide his fate." The High Sparrow offered no resistance. The guards seized his arms, ushering him out into the corridor. Marjorie stayed behind in the dim sept for a moment, letting her tears fall. She recalled the day the Faith had arrested her and Tommen had stood helpless. How had it come to this? All their illusions of piety and justice lay in ruins. By the time Marjorie composed herself and followed, the High Sparrow was already being hustled through a back passage. They brought him to a small receiving room near the Great Hall, where Lady Olenna awaited with a retinue of knights. At the sight of the old man in rags, she raised her chin and said, "Well, you are the cause of all this misery. You have some nerve skulking around my castle." He did not reply immediately. Marjorie stepped close to her grandmother. "I found him praying," she said softly. "He didn't resist arrest." Lady Olenna peered at the High Sparrow as though he were some venomous insect. "You dethroned a king, paraded a queen through your twisted trials, and consorted with that monstrous Circe. You nearly burned the city to the ground. The Tyrells lost many good men trying to restore order. Give me one reason not to dispatch you on the spot." The High Sparrow looked at her, calm. "My life means little. If you slay me, the small folk will see it as one more act of noble tyranny. Perhaps that does not trouble you. But know that it may sow seeds of another revolt down the line, and another after that, until the realm is drowned in blood." Lady Olenna's lip curled. "So you threaten me with the notion of martyrdom? How very predictable." He inclined his head. "I threaten nothing. I merely state what is." Silence stretched. Marjorie saw her grandmother's eyes flick to the guards. Lady Olenna was fully capable of ordering them to plunge swords into him right then and there. "It seems we'd best keep you in a secure cell, then," the old woman said. "Let you rot until we can decide how best to remove your head without making you a martyr." The High Sparrow bowed in acceptance. "As you will." And so it was done. He was taken below to a guarded cell, not in the traditional black cells under the Red Keep. Those were half collapsed from the chaos. Instead, a small storeroom near the kitchens had been converted into a makeshift prison. Soldiers stood watch at all times, rotating in pairs. Lady Olenna's plan, it seemed, was to keep him in silent confinement, away from any audience, so that his preaching could not spread. Perhaps one day she would quietly have him executed, or perhaps he would die of old age in the darkness. Either way, she sought to deny him the platform to become a legendary martyr. Word soon leaked, though. Rumors told that the High Sparrow had been captured. Some claimed he had called down curses upon the Tyrells. Others said he had gone meekly. Small knots of the faithful gathered to pray for his release, but Tyrell soldiers quickly dispersed them. Fortunately, the capital was too weary for a full uprising. Each day brought more exhaustion, more acceptance of Tyrell rule as the only bulwark against anarchy. Thus, in the weeks and months that followed, King's Landing stabilized under the Tyrell governance. Fields were replanted, trade routes reopened, families who had fled slowly trickled back. The city would bear scars for a generation or more, but the fires were doused, the dead buried, and a semblance of normalcy returned. The throne in the Great Hall remained unoccupied. Lady Olenna oversaw a provisional council, with Marjorie handling charitable distributions and public relations. The masses viewed Marjorie as a sympathetic figure who had suffered alongside them, and that kept resentment from boiling over. Wherever Circe and Tommen had gone, they did not surface soon. Whispers placed them in the Westerlands, licking their wounds. Perhaps they waited for an opportune time to reclaim the throne. Perhaps Tommen was content to remain hidden, traumatized by the memory of his dethronement and the city's downfall. Either way, the crown lay in limbo, and the realm's future was uncertain. Some said a great council would be called to decide a new monarch if Tommen did not return by year's end. Others spoke of Daenerys Targaryen's rumored approach across the Narrow Sea, or of new alliances that might reshape the political landscape. For now, House Tyrell kept a firm grip on the battered capital, building a fragile peace from the rubble. As for Theoden Wells, word eventually arrived that his ship had docked at Eastwatch by the Sea after a stormy voyage. He presented himself at the gates in tattered clothes, carrying a staff for support. The Black brothers there, hearing he wished to take the Black, were perplexed at first by his identity. A dethroned king from the Faith Militant's coup? But they had seen stranger things in the north. Many men came to the wall with ruin behind them. They took him in, gave him the customary vow. He laid aside any claim to lands or titles, though none remained to him anyway. And so he became a brother of the Night's Watch, anonymous among the lines of men who wore black cloaks and patrolled the ice. In the bitter cold, he found a certain solace. At times, he heard news from the south, snippets about the capital's recovery, the Tyrell administration, the uncertain fate of Tommen. He prayed for them all, but no one in King's Landing prayed for him anymore, except perhaps Marjorie on the rare occasion she thought of him. He would live and die as a man of the wall, free at last from the monstrous seat of swords that had nearly devoured his soul. In the Red Keep, one final hush fell across that dreadful chapter of the city's history. The Faith Militant's fleeting rule became a cautionary tale. How religious zeal, when wedded to worldly power, could set a city aflame. Marjorie, standing on the ramparts at dusk, would remember Tommen's gentle smile, the High Sparrow's fanatical conviction, and Theoden's remorseful eyes. She would look over the scars of King's Landing, the collapsed towers, the blackened squares, and wonder if the realm would ever find a path to lasting peace. But the sun always rose, even if behind a veil of smoke, and the people carried on. In the end, that was the truest testament of all, that despite kings rising and falling, despite Septon's preaching and armies clashing, life persisted. And so the city that had burned under the Faith's righteous flames now tried to heal under Tyrell's stewardship, awaiting the next turn of the wheel that shaped the fate of Westeros.